Release that witch eye by Ermu. Chapter 261 Gifts. After dinner, Nightingale returned to the bedroom while holding the unopened box in her hands. She was followed by Lightning, Maggie, Lily, and Mystery Moon, who also entered after her, keeping their attention focused on the box the entire time. "How is it?" Wendy couldn't stop herself from teasing them. "Would you like to take a look at what's inside?" Except for Lily, the three others nodded again and again. "His Highness is totally biased." Lightning muttered, "First he doesn't let us taste the wine, and now we don't even get a gift. He said that it was only for the adult witches." "Ah," Lily sighed, "just wait until you are old enough. If you asked him then, you would also get one. Furthermore, I'm not interested at all about what kind of cloth is inside, so why did you drag me over here?" "Hey," Mystery Moon looked amazed, "I merely called you, no one pulled you along." "Ah. Stop, that isn't the important point." Lightning shouted, "Mystery Moon is already of age, and Maggie is also an adult, but they both didn't get it." "That's right, phew." Maggie pushed the white hair which covered her face to the back and raised her chin in protest. "I also didn't get it, phew." His Royal Highness surely has his own reasons for doing that. Nightingale also felt that it was a bit strange. Previously Roland had never treated anyone differently, so why did he do so this time? For now, let us just look at what is inside. When she opened the box, all she saw was a strange piece of clothing. It looked like something made out of a few bands and 2 pockets. When she touched it, it felt very soft and had evidently been made out of the highest quality silk fabric. But no matter how she looked at it, she couldn't understand what kind of cloth this should be. It was simply too small. "There is a piece of paper under it," Lightning suddenly shouted. After spreading out the sheet of paper, Nightingale discovered that it not only contained a description and usage for the gift, but also a diagram describing how it should be used. Wendy, who had opened her own box, asked in confusion, "This thing is called a bra?" "It can bring relief to the chest area by reducing its weight. It promotes blood circulation, stabilizes the posture while simultaneously lessening the discomfort caused by friction to the skin." Reading the letter, Nightingale's voice became smaller and smaller, while her cheeks suddenly became hot and red. "This thing is actually used to hold the chest?" She couldn't stop her eyes from wandering over to Wendy, only to discover that the other witch's vision had simultaneously moved over to her. They all suddenly showed an understanding expression. "Pfft," Lily couldn't suppress her laugh any longer. "Now you finally understand why you didn't receive a present, right?" TSK, now I have to correct my words from before. Even if Lightning was fully grown up, it might be possible that she still won't receive a gift. "The same seems to be true for you," Mystery Moon said while she goggled at her. "I don't want it anyway." The latter turned away and showed a supercilious expression. "This should be similar to a skin-tight corset, right?" Only Lightning seemed to be completely unmoved. Rather, she was looking at it with eyes full of curiosity and envy. "Can you wear it so that I can take a look?" "Of course not." Wendy suddenly exposed a rarely seen embarrassed appearance, then started driving the 4 of them out. Only then was she able to feel relief. "How can it be that His Highness suddenly present us with this?" Thinking about it, Nightingale also felt a bit embarrassed. If he had given simple personal clothes, it would have still been proper. After all, we usually fetched ours from the castle anyway, so no one would feel too embarrassed about it. But these clothes are made with different sizes, which means that before Roland gave us our gift, he had carefully observed each person's size. The idea of this caused her to blush, and she couldn't help but want to hide in her fog to escape. "By the way, what would Anna do?" "I'm leaving, but I will return quickly," Nightingale said, then stepped into the fog, passed through the walls. Hesitating for only a moment when she came over to Anna's bedroom, but she still decided to knock on the door. Soon the door opened, showing Anna, dressed in a nightgown, looking the same as usual. "Is there anything?" I want to ask." Nightingale stepped into the room and closed the door. "His Royal Highness also sent a gift to you, right? What do you think about it?" "I'm already wearing mine, it's very convenient." The other side's answer caught her somewhat off guard. "You already put it on?" Anna nodded. "Do you want to see?" No, no, that's not necessary, she hurriedly waved her hand to stop Anna. I just want to ask, do you not think it's strange? Why? Anna became clearly puzzled. His Royal Highness already said that he wanted to promote it and sell it as a commodity to even more people. So we need to help him by wearing them in advance. And also, they are pretty good, she patted her chest, it's both soft and flexible. Also, with the hook at the back, it isn't so easy for others to take it off, so it's much better than wearing many layers of undergarments. So, that's how it is. Nightingale couldn't refrain from sighing in sorrow. She doesn't care about these minutiae things. Instead, she only focuses on achieving His Highness' goal. Perhaps this is what makes her so unique, she was pure and straightforward. Since it was a gift from Roland, Nightingale knew that she would try it in the end, so what reason was there to be so self-conscious about? Previously it has also been the same thing, it was completely unnecessary to wish that he didn't see me. Instead, I should have confidently told him my thoughts right away. If it had been Anna, that's definitely what she would have done, right? Thinking of this, Nightingale returned to her room, picked up the bra and studied it for a while, then hid in the fog as she put it on, before covering herself with her usual outer clothing, and finally reappearing before Wendy afterward. It's a little too big, she tried jumping, but it is indeed very comfortable to wear. At least it isn't as rough as those boring old clothes, they would always painfully rub my chest. Moreover, they do not affect one's movement, which makes it unnecessary to bind a cloth band around your chest, which is quite convenient. You should also to try it. No, I still do not need, Wendy shook her head. How can that be? Nightingale chuckled while pulling the other into the fog. I always feel it was because of you, that His Highness designed this. Asterisk. Sylvie felt that today she had seen more marvelous things than in the past few years put together. The pipe which released water at the mere pull of a lever. The soap which cleared away dirt and left behind a fragrant odor. And the drink which set the throat aflame, but could it be that Evelyn had already finished her task by accompanying His Highness to drink the 3 cups of wine? Naturally, the most incredible part was the gifts which had been given out after dinner. She knew that the nobility had the practice of sending over corsets when they approached someone, however, others would usually pair it with a cinched waist dress. Who would just gift this outright by itself? And even if they send it as a gift, it would only be sent to people they are very close to, for example, lovers. But listening to His Highness' explanation, he didn't plan on only giving this close-fitting garment to just the witches, but to also spread it even further. Does he want to spread it through the whole Western Territory? Sylvie could feel goosebumps all over her body. What kind of noble would choose to do this business, or could it be, does he have some kind of unusual interest in the chest and buttocks? After Nightingale pulled Wendy into the fog, she could only vaguely see 2 blurs of light and shadow floating near the bedside. Since they didn't come out after a long time, it was obviously that under the former's coaxing Wendy had finally decided on accepting the gift. Then, what about the other witches? Do none of them understand the meaning of sending over personal clothes? Recalling Ash's warning, Sylvie couldn't help but swallow. She was right, His Highness is indeed a dangerous person. If I can, it's better to stay even further away from him. Chapter 262 The Bridge Across the Redwater River. A week later, Roland officially started the Great Steel Bridge construction project. You mean, I should raise 2 lands in the middle of the river, which will act as the foothold of the bridge pier? Lotus looked at the surging river and asked in amazement, don't tell me you plan to construct an actual bridge, rather than a pontoon bridge to connect both sides of the river? Yes, Roland spread out the scroll he held in his hand, taking into account the impact of the river current. It is necessary for the 2 pieces of land to have a certain volume. They also need to be constructed in this way to reduce the force of the impact. This looks like a ship. Lotus let her view wander across the blueprint. That's right, speaking accurately it's called the spindle type, he nodded. As long as they are built parallel to the direction of the flow, the impact it receives from the front will be reduced to the smallest amount possible. The problem is that the Redwater River is nearly 10 meters deep. Will you still be able to make the earth rise? This shouldn't be hard to do, Your Highness, Lotus simply replied, just give it to me. To be safe, the ship responsible for carrying the witch was Little Town, standing on the massive hull of the cement ship floating in the river was like standing on land. It was still Lightning who took over the position of the helmsman, while Wendy was again responsible for providing the wind. But during the last week, it seemed that the latter had avoided the prince's line of sight, seemingly feeling a bit uncomfortable. Until this day when Roland saw her walking around with her head held up, looking as if she was back to her usual self again. And finally, when she went past him to board the ship, he even heard her whispering a soft thank you. "This is something you can come thank me for," Nightingale whispered into his ear from within her fog. The Little Town soon left the pier, driving to the center of the wide river. Carter had already pulled a hemp rope across the river. There were 2 red cloth belts tied to it which marked the location for the piers. After the cement boat arrived at the site of the first pier, Lotus went to the ship's railing and began to put her ability to use. Looking at the river, its surface suddenly resembled boiling water, sending up one bubble after the other, while slowly forming a hill. Not long after, gravel together with algae and silt began to rise from within the surging river water, gradually turning all of the water muddy. So, that's how it works, Roland thought. Her ability could not only transform a solid surface, but also water. Furthermore, it was even easier to lift than loose gravel was. Even though the surging river was immediately washing it away, but by now the river bed had already been lifted up a little. Not long after, a gray mass of mud appeared on the water surface. It seemed to be very soft, but it also gave off a very unpleasant odor, making it impossible for all those present to not cover their noses. However, in Roland's eyes, this gray mass was the best kind of fertilizer. The soil contained hundreds of years of fish and other aquatic bones, aquatic plants, as well as the inhabitants of the depths' excrement. If the transport wasn't too inconvenient, Roland would like to gather all of this soil and use it as fertilizer. Unfortunately, at present, it could only be collected by hand through directly entering the river water. So, after clearing up the fertilizer layers and improving the section, he finally saw the yellow-brown solid earth he had waiting for. The following steps were to repeat the process again and again until the 2 pieces of land had been fully formed. Roland expected that this course of event would at least continue for around 1 week, but even after the soil was lifted up and broke through the water surface, it didn't mean that the land could be used. The flow of the river would unceasingly carry away the silt, and without further protection, even if the piers were formed according to the spindle design, they wouldn't be able to persevere for longer than 10 years. Trying to come to a conclusion, Roland called Karl van Bate to his side, took out a piece of charcoal, and began to paint the steps needed to solidify the ground. "Is your idea to dig holes into the soil and fill them up with cement?" This newly promoted Minister of Construction asked after analyzing the drawing. He once more proved why he had once been one of the most exceptional members of King City's stonemason guild, Roland thought in satisfaction. With only a few words of what I was able to remember, and he immediately managed to understand my intentions. "That's right, but every segment mustn't exceed 5 meters in length, while it should be around 1 meter in depth. When you're filling it up with cement, call for Lotus to let her bury it 1 meter into the earth. By repeating this we will be able to form a cement wall which goes straight from the surface of the river and into the river bed." Roland had come up with this plan after seeing Lotus' ability in action. Since she could control the surface and make it drop, she could presumably also bury a structure that was above the earth into the ground. "Your idea is indeed extremely ingenious," Karl said with sparkling eyes. "This way, even if the river washed away the outer soil, there will still be the cement wall left to block the water." Roland nodded. "The crucial point is to control the overall height of the cement blocks. If it is too small, it will lead to the problem where the bottom part will become unstable, while if it's more than needed, besides the waste of cement it will also delay the construction. So, I am laying responsibility for this take on your shoulders." "Yes, Your Royal Highness," Karl agreed, looking at the silt and soft soil coming up. "I am guessing that the final height of the cement wall should be around 12 meters. Also, after you surround all sides with the cement wall, don't cover the land in the middle with cement. I want to grow several kinds of flowers and grass on top of it afterwards," the prince warned repeatedly. "Several kind of flowers?" Carl looked confused. After all, these walls were unable to be made watertight, and when the segments had to be repaired, there would always be gaps left behind. If you wished to consolidate the soil, the simplest method was to plant different kinds of grass and flowers. The vegetation would reduce the water within the ground, while also reducing the soil erosion. That would be especially true after leaves came and used her magic to lengthen the weed's root system, in that way ensuring that the earth would be firmly knit together. After a simple explanation on how plants could strengthen the soil, Roland turned to look at the workers who were busy on the river banks. What is the current state of the bridge's approach construction? We are right in the middle of laying the cement gravel for the road surface, Carl reported without thinking. They should be completed by this week. According to the plan, the approaches on either side of the river would be made by piled-up fieldstone and cement, just like they had done with the city walls. As long as the positioning and measurement was correct, the construction itself wouldn't be that complicated. The highest point of the ramp was 7 meters above ground, and it connected with the city streets through a long, gentle and curving slope. There was also some further height difference between the river's dike compared to the water surface. After finishing the construction of the bridge, the difference between the water surface and the bridge should be around 12 meters, which ought to be high enough for sailing ships to pass through. So far only the first step of the bridge itself was completed, and it was currently undergoing a strength test on the shore. Due to its small span, the load placed on it would be very small. This way the bridge would still be reliable even though Roland was ignorant about bridge engineering. In the absence of the 8-wheel trucks from appearing in later centuries, a 30-centimeter-strong I-beam should guarantee the bridge's stability. Even if the bridge was completely filled with people, it would still be impossible to break the steel beam. Even more so since the process of its construction, from assembling to welding it, had been completely taken care of by Anna, so the probability of a jerry-built construction project was extremely low. Equally, the installation of the bridge would also be very simple. When the 3-span bridge was completed, Hummingbird would use her ability to reduce its weight and would then give it to Lightning so that she could take it to its intended location. From that point on, 2 wagons in parallel could use the steel bridge to cross the Redwater River at the same, something which truly connected the northern and southern side. Even if they were the greatest of mason, it would still be hard for them to imagine such a magnificent bridge, Carl lamented as he looked at the wide river's sparkling surface. Your Royal Highness, does this steel bridge have a name? After thinking about it, Roland announced, I presume it should be called Redwater Bridge. Chapter 263 Ripened Wheat. Under the hot scorching sun, Sirius Daly, wearing a straw hat, was walking along the river's shore, examining the growth of the wheat. Now 4 months after the planting, this day was the day in which the wheat had finally ripened. As far as the eye could see, there was an unending cornfield surrounding him like a golden ocean. The wheat's ears were thick and full, the amount of fruit had more than doubled, and was even bigger than that of any spring wheat he had seen before. There was no need to wait until the weighing of the harvest. Sirius already knew that this year was bound to be a bumper harvest. Without a doubt, this was surely because of the witch's contribution. He had accompanied his father in planting for 10 years now, so he naturally knew what common wheat looked like. One wheat plant would have between 1 to 3 ears, and each ear could produce 20 to 30 fruits. That the fertility of the soil could actually influence the wheat grain's size was still believable, but could it so straightforwardly double the size of the caryopsis? Besides it being the work of a witch, he could think of no other explanation for this. It seems that there had been many changes like this one, for instances, the new water towers looming over Border Town. He had once observed those huge monstrosities from close up, and come to the conclusion that it would be impossible to install those steel tubes that were even larger than a residential building by depending on human strength alone, yet they had been built almost overnight. Nowadays, the people living in the new district only seldom needed to carry a bucket and go draw water. As long as they unscrewed the faucet, cool well water would come flowing out from the pipe. The same was true for the islands at the center of the Redwater River. Since His Highness had held the honor and reward ceremony, and Miss Nana had been put on the stage, the usage of the witches became more and more known. Raising those islands in the middle of the river was obviously something that only witches could do. He had already asked City Hall's Premier Minister Barev about this matter, But the answer he got in return was that he didn't need to understand it. His Highness Roland naturally had his way. I presume it should be okay. After all, the royal family always loved to meet head-on with the church. Even if the latter sends troops to suppress His Highness, they would have first to beat the First Army, only then would they be qualified to speak. Otherwise, the Western Territory can only ever belong to Roland Wimbledon. Duke Ryan is only the latest example. Sir, you have come. Two serfs in the field who noted Sirius daily, immediately came forward and greeted him. You see, this piece of wheat field can be harvested now, therefore, may I ask you? We wish to ask, sir, if the Lord's previous statements are still valid? That's right, the other serf agreed while at the same time nervously rubbing his hands. Can we really be promoted to free people? As the head of the Ministry of Agriculture, besides recording the best way to plant and creating a statistic about the harvest, Sirius also had another important responsibility. That was to communicate with the serfs so that they would listen to His Highness as well as the City Hall's policy. Although he didn't like coming in contact with these country bumpkins who all day long spent their life in mud, but his knight's self-discipline still let him fulfill his task. Do you see those slogans? Sirius reached out with his hand and pointed towards the banner at the side of the farmland. Sir, I cannot read, the serf confessed with an embarrassed smile. Labor creates wealth, and work changes destiny, he stated. In other words, as long as you try to cultivate, you will have the opportunity to be promoted to become a free person. This is His Highness' promise, and it will come true. Is that so? That's great. After becoming a free man, you can live in the town center area, get your own brick house, as well as the right to a primary education. After that, you will no longer need to ask me for the meaning of that slogan. Sirius once more repeated the corresponding propaganda. Yes, sir, the serf nodded excitedly. The weather is so hot, do you want to go to my shed and have a cup of cold water? I couldn't, right now you must be very busy. He said and waved in the direction of the fields. Understanding his meaning, the two quickly said their thanks and bowed for a long time before finally returning to their areas and busying themselves with their work. This was the most frequently asked question he'd heard in the last month. No matter how often he preached so, they would always take the trouble of coming to ask him again, fearing that His Highness would decide to cancel this policy in the blink of an eye. Not much further down the road, he was once again encircled by a group of people. Hello, Sir Sirius, after drying the wheat harvest, do we really only have to pay 7/10? Hearing the question, Sirius cried within his heart. This question's frequency was second only to that of the free person promotion. During the first year, this is indeed the case, and from then on it will only become less and less. If you're promoted to become a freed person, you will only have to turn over 2/10. We have already repeatedly stressed this point. As if I will ever be promoted, a tall man said while touching the back of his head, that remaining 3/10 of wheat, can only be sold to His Highness, or used for your food, or be kept as seeds. Sirius clapped his hands, bluntly calling all the surrounding serfs to come over. Everyone listen well, border town prohibit anyone from privately selling food. It doesn't matter whether it is sold to local townspeople, or to foreign businessmen, it is a violation of border town's law. If you do it, not only will your income be confiscated, you can also be imprisoned. What should we do if the Lord only offers a very low price? The tall man muttered. It's only natural that there will be that kind of circumstance. The acquisition of food by His Highness is to stabilize the market price, so no matter if you have a poor harvest or a bumper harvest, it is unlikely to cause a substantial change in the price. Therefore, you don't have to hold wheat back in fear that you don't have enough to eat after selling it. You also don't have to worry about harvesting too much and being unable to sell, or of only being able to sell at a low price. Sirius emphasized again, there is only one place in the whole border town where you can sell food, that is the convenience market, and that market falls under the management of our city hall. In the end, the price will be. Rest assured, His Royal Highness himself will announce it before he starts the acquisition. Looking at the serfs dispersing in groups of 2s and 3s, Sirius licked his dry lips and continued to check on the crops. He did not know how many of them would keep his words in mind, but Sir Barif had made it clear that His Highness would drive a hard line in case he discovered any people smuggling food, punishing them severely. At that time, a young serf broke away from the crowd and turned back. "Sir," he gasped, "I would like to ask you a question." "Yes? Do you know where Miss May and Miss Irene have gone?" He hesitated. "Recently there haven't been any plays performed in the central square, so I wanted to ask you about their situation, whether or not they fell ill." This was a new and exciting question. Sirius couldn't refrain himself from raising the corner of his mouth. If he hadn't seen them in the city hall going through the formalities, he would have been unable to answer it. "They went to Longsong Stronghold." "Ah," the other side showed a disappointed expression. "Don't tell me that they no longer intend to stay in Border Town?" "They merely went to the Stronghold Theater to perform," he shrugged. "Furthermore, the weather is so hot nowadays, no one would have the heart to see them standing under the sun and drenched in sweat, right? Wait until fall, they will come back and perform a new show in the square. It is actually like this, thank you, sir." Looking at the back of the perfectly contented young man who was leaving, Sirius couldn't help but think of himself, from a knight to a captive, then from being a prisoner to a city hall officer. The experience of the past few months could be described as a series of ups and downs. He no longer wanted to return to his home in the Wolf territory. There he had nothing besides his shabby house and a flaky piece of wheat field. The reason why he had become a knight was to break away from his father's lifestyle as a farmer. Not every knight was as well regarded as Morning Light, who as the Duke's personal knight had the best territory and also his own entourage. His yearly salary now was more than he had ever gotten while being a knight, and there was still vast room left for growth. Perhaps it was finally time to bring his parents to Border Town, then marry a girl and start enjoying life. Chapter 264 Bumper Harvest. Border Towns finally welcomed its first day of harvest. Braving the hot sun, the serfs cut the straw stalks with their sickles and tied the batches of wheat into bundles so that they could move them to the other side of the river at a later time. Roland knew that freeing the wheat grain from the wheat kernel was a very cumbersome process, and the mechanical farm tools and harvesters also aren't invented yet, so for now they will still have to use their hands to separate, clean, dry, and screen the wheat. After the stalks of grain had been moved back to the camp, the serfs spread them out on the ground to dry in the sun and gathered several kinds of tools, which more exactly was anything that they could lay their hands on, wooden sticks, stones, or rakes. They used these tools to repeatedly strike the wheat stalks and ears, trying to free the caryopsis from their hull, a process which often lasted for 3 to 4 days. In Roland's memory, the rural areas would often use cows and donkeys to pull a stone roller which pressed the grains out of their shell. Not only did it save a lot of labor, but it also removed the husks more evenly than when striking it. Roland had no other choice but to accept Border Town's backward standard of agriculture. After the striking, the serfs again used anything they could to turn over the wheat, even using wooden sticks if they didn't have any forks. Those who had nothing else even used their hands to directly grab the wheat stalks and throw them into the sky, the same as when turning stir-fry over in a pot. After going through the first striking, most of the outer shells of the grain should already be broken. This process should allow the fruits to separate from the ear of wheat. In fact, after threshing, the remaining wheat straw still had plenty of uses. After being crushed, it could be returned to the fields or could be used as bedding for livestock. It could also be made into fodder or used for paper making. However, Roland didn't have enough time to promote a green industry at the moment. All he could do was look on as the serfs brought those wheat straws to the riverside and burned them. In the days that followed, Border Town's sky was covered with a dusky smoke which was comparable to the time of the former cement powder pollution. During this time, Redwater Bridge's 2 spindly-type islands had also been finished, with the construction of the concrete walls having also gone according to plan. For the base of the bridge pier they had used the same prefabricated method as for the main bridge, first placing the steel and concrete into trenches to form the columns of reinforced steel, then reduce the weight and lift the walls in place. Finally it was Loda's turn. She was in charge of sinking the walls into the earth until only a section of the steel plate was still exposed, to which they would later connect the bridge to. While handling these 2 projects, Roland spent this whole week traveling between the Redwater Bridge and the fields, which ended up giving him quite the tan. By the time the straw was cleared away with forks, only layers of grain and their husk was still left in the grainyard. The serfs then swept it all together and piled it into small hills. They then stepped on top of those hills and used their shovels to throw the grains and husks into the air. Because the husks were so much lighter than the fruit, they were blown away further by the wind. As a result, the grain was still left at the foot of the hills, while the empty shells and debris laid at a distant location. By using this kind of method, the serfs were slowly able to gather all of the grains. Of course, wanting to completely clean up the husks was impossible. Furthermore, this process mixed the grain with the mud and gravel. Thus Roland decided that by next year's harvest, he would need to have prepared a sufficient batch of farm tools in advance. Inventing a harvester wouldn't be possible, but the sheller machine should still be easily to realize. He merely had to exchange the stone roller with a millstone. Furthermore, he could also install a sieve beneath it and use an air blower to separate the grain from the chaff. When the plump wheat grains were evenly spread over the whole valley, it looked like as if the entire northern shore of the Redwater River was covered by a golden layer. Looking at these golden fruits, Roland's heart was filled with a sense of accomplishment. No matter whether the harvest would be enough to fill the bellies of 10,000 people, at least for Border Town, this counted as a memorable day. From today on, Border Town's food supply would gradually change from being totally dependent on imports to achieving self-sufficiency. After drying for 3 days, the wheat was all stuffed into bags and weighted. "Your Highness, this was a great harvest." In the afternoon, Berev excitedly rushed into the office. According to the preliminary statistics from City Hall, each field's allocated output was at least fourfold more than normal. The highest output even reached 6 times as much. "So this year's harvest will be enough to fill all your subjects' belly." "Is that so?" Roland couldn't help but laugh. It seems that the new barn in the castle district will no longer be so empty. Do you know what this means? The expression on the City Hall's premier minister seemed to be even more excited than Roland's. Border Town only needs to increase their numbers of farmers by 2,000. And we will be able to satisfy the food consumption of 50,000 to 60,000 people. This is simply inconceivable. Border Town can definitely expand to become Greycastle's largest city. No, he paused, the most magnificent city in the whole mainland. The main reason why the city's population of this era didn't increase was because that the food production capability was just too small. For example, big cities like King's City that had more than 20,000 people needed more than a dozen surrounding villages to provide them with enough food. Each village would once more needed almost 1,000 or 2,000 people. If even just half of them were engaged in farming, it could be estimated that nearly 20,000 people were needed to support another 20,000. In other words, a farmer's food production, in addition to feeding their family and themselves, was up to one other city residents. This was the so-called invisible restriction of production capability. Roland feared it would be difficult for Berev to imagine that after the mechanization of farming, just one person's output was enough to support tens of thousands of people. And that Border Town, in the absence of developing and spreading of agricultural technology, was still able to acquire this kind of bumper harvest, was mainly a credit to Lee's magically transformed golden ones. To employ as few farmers as possible for feeding as many people as possible. Liberating the human resources from simply cultivating land to move on to the industrial production was the strategy that Roland had decided on from the beginning. Now, after the Ministry of Agriculture had obtained the best planting process, coupled with the iron farming tools and machines to help with the farming coming next year, the per capita production was bound to become higher and higher. In the evening, Roland once again held a bonfire speech at the shore of the Redwater River. It seems to be a return to the time from 4 months ago. It was evening, there was a roaring fire in the background, the crowd formed a dense mass, and the last rays of twilight fell over everyone's face. The only difference to that day was the expression on each person's face, compared to the beginning of when they had arrived and were feeling both terrified and uneasy. Their faces on this day were all brimming with joy at the bumper harvest and couldn't conceal the expectation in their eyes. Roland stretched out his hand and moved it downwards, the scene around him quieting down immediately. Everyone was holding his breath, waiting for the prince to fulfill his promise. I know what you want to hear. He did not follow his usual practice of first announcing his name, and instead came straight to the matter. I can tell you without a doubt that the previously announced rules of promotion are still valid and will hold. Just this sentence was enough to detonate the atmosphere of the scene. Not one person there could restrain themselves from shouting out loud. Many people fell on their knees and praised the prince's kindness. Long live the Lord! Long live His Royal Highness! After the end of the grain weighing, the promotion list will be announced. The moment the shouts had subsided a little, Roland continued, the city hall will be responsible for your promotion to a freed person. At that time you can choose to either continue farming or come find a new job in border town. Also, starting from next year, if your harvest next year is the same as those promoted this year, even if the output is not on the forefront, you will still be freed. In other words, as long as you work hard, you will be able to rid yourself of your status as serfs. As I said, labor creates wealth, labor changes destiny. He paused for a moment, looked around and then continued, I hope that in the coming days, there will be no longer any serfs in border town, and everyone will be my real subject. The moment Roland's voice faded, the people's cheers unceasingly resonated throughout the sky above the Redwater River. Chapter 265 The Last Enemy. Timothy entered the Lord of the Port of Clear Water's circular room located at the top of the tower. Different from the more commonly seen castles, this tower was both higher and narrower. Apart from dealing with government or for observing the outside, he was afraid that even gathering all of his cabinet ministers here to hold a council meeting was already impossible. None of the furnishings in the room had been moved. It was as if the owner had just left and would soon return. Facing the entrance was a reddish-brown square table. Books were neatly and tidily arranged on it. And in the middle were several unfinished manuscripts and a quill that was inserted into an ink bottle, as if just waiting for someone to come and complete the files. Taking one step at a time, Timothy walked to the table and sat in the large chair. The seat was covered with a cooling mat that was sewn out of bamboo sticks. Something that was quite suitable for easing the sizzling heat of the final month of summer. A bucket of water had been placed next to the chair. It was evidently used to hold ice, also serving to dispel the room's heat and lower the temperature. However, today's weather was a bit gloomy. There were dark clouds over the sea, which lowered the temperature and made the room appear to be less stiflingly hot. Timothy leaned forward, placed his face close to the surface of the tabletop and gently smelled it, filling up his nostrils with a faint and sweet scent. This was Garcia's most loved bluish-green sunflower fragrance. It was produced at the Cold Wind Mountain Ridge, and when compared with rugosa rose and rosemary it had a more unique and refreshing feeling, as if it contained some of the ice from the north. Only after using something for a long time would it take over one's smell. There was no doubt that his sister enjoyed sitting on this chair, her hands on this table, either listening to a report or busy writing a decree. Thinking about this, Timothy couldn't stop himself from laughing. Ha ha, ha, ha ha, ha 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 ha. In the end, Timothy simply leaned against the back of the chair, raised his head and started to laugh at the top of his voice. He had finally won. Garcia had given up Port of Clear Water, and given up the Southern Territory. That was tantamount to giving up the throne of Grey Castle. After receiving news that the Black Sail Fleet was sailing north, he immediately summoned the troops under his command and drove more than 5,000 slaves, rats and criminals to the southern border and attacked Garcia's nest at the Port of Clear Water. The only resistance he encountered came from the Sand People from the extreme south. Timothy didn't know what kind promise they had agreed on, but they attacked him one after another, having no fear for their own lives. Moreover, the troublesome point was that they were also in possession of the Berserker Pill. The battle lasted for nearly half a month, but by exploiting his superior numbers, and repeatedly disrupting his enemy's counterattack, Timothy was able to slowly erode the Sand People's defense line. Nearly 3,000 of his people had died in this battle of attrition, and if his men hadn't received the support of the pills, Timothy was afraid that his mob wouldn't have dared to set even a single foot on this battlefield. Not to mention ever dare fight against the fierce and barbaric Sand People here who had fought to their death. The final result of the battle was that he had to cross over a layer of corpses to be able to enter Port of Clear Water's Lord Tower. The title Queen of Clear Water was history, the south of Grey Castle had finally come back under his control. "Your Majesty?" Probably from hearing his carefree laughter, the knight keeping guard outside pushed open the door and entered the room. "No harm," Timothy answered and got up. He pointed to the knight and then over to himself, instructing him to follow, and then went through a side door to step on the balcony. He was immediately hit by the slightly salty sea breeze, which made his gown flutter. It seemed there was a storm approaching from looking at the dark clouds standing overhead that were growing thicker and thicker. "That's truly unfortunately," Timothy thought. "I was planning to see my third sister's port, piers, and the Lord's Tower all fall victim to the flames, but now it seems this will be impossible." The last half-year he had constantly been on the battlefield alongside his soldiers. There was hardly 1 month where he had stayed within King's City. He had entrusted his imperial prime minister to take care of all the government's affairs, although Marquis Wyke had seemed to be very loyal, but loyalty didn't mean that the other was able to forever lock their doorway and resist temptation, Gerald Wimbledon being the best example of this. He needed to return to King's City as soon as he could to stabilize the undercurrents of political unrest going on over there. The rain in the south would probably go on for several days he couldn't waste with waiting over here. "I will go back to King's City early tomorrow morning," Timothy opened his mouth and declared, "except for my personal guards and the knights from King's City, all the other knights and mercenaries will be handed over to you. Sir Ed Hawes, please take my place in defending the southern border. You must not allow the Sand People to even set a single foot within Grey Castle's borders." "You will let me stay here?" the young knight of the Northern Hawes family asked in surprise. "But I would like to continue to fight at your side, Your Majesty." "I, knight, by defending the borderland you will also fight for me." Timothy interrupted, "Listen, there are still many things you need to do. So I have to leave the Southern Territory in the hands of loyal and competent people who are able to deal with the aftermath." But Ed was still a bit hesitant. "I know what you are worried about," the new king smiled understandingly and patted his shoulders. "Rest assured, you won't stay here forever. When the matter regarding Port of Clearwater is finished, I will immediately recall you back to King's City. After all, Grey Castle is not unified yet. I still need to recover the Western Territory, and for that, I will need even more knights who can charge in and break through the enemy's lines. So, how could I ever forget you here?" Hearing these reassuring words, the young man looked up with shining eyes, knelt down then said, "As you bid, Your Majesty." "Get up," Timothy said while nodding with satisfaction. "There are 3 things you have to do next. First, you have to take all the remaining inhabitants of Port of Clearwater into custody and escort them back to King's City." "Don't you want to hang these traitors?" the knight asked surprised. "No, they cannot be considered as real traitors. If they had indeed joined Garcia's side, they would have long left with the Black Sail fleet. If I kill these people, it would only suit her more. However, my third sister's influence is really beyond my expectation. Of the more than 10,000 inhabitants of Port of Clearwater, plus the captive slaves from Eagle City, there were actually only 400 people who didn't want to leave with her. If not for the Sand People's resistance, the Port of Clearwater would have been no different from an abandoned city." "Your Majesty is benevolent." "The second thing you have to do is burn all the docks, shipyards and the Lord's Tower. I want to let everyone in the South see that Garcia, the Queen of Clearwater, has ceased to be. Even if she comes fleeing back, only ruins will be left for her to return to." "Yes," the knight agreed. "The last thing I ask is that you gather all the refugees for me." Timothy looked at the horizon over the sea, then calmly said, "Furthermore, any homeless man, rat, bandit, and even the Sand People are acceptable. From the Battle of Eagle City until today, the dispute in the Southern Territory has never been quietened down, so you should be able to find a large number of refugees living in the surrounding villages and towns. What kinds of methods you use to gather them doesn't matter, only that before the war against the West begins you will need to provide me with at least 5,000 men." Garcia's escape proved the correctness of his strategy. As the ruler of more than half of Grey Castle's population, he should use them to fight against the rebels, under normal circumstances, with a team of 100 knights leading an army of several thousand commoners. the knights usually wouldn't even need to participate in the battle. Their only responsibility would be the distribution of the pills and commanding the battle. In front of an enemy who had the advantage of absolute numbers, as long as they unceasingly attacked, the enemy would be unable to resist them. If Garcia had shown an unwavering will and decided to defend Port of Clear Water to the death instead of retreating, she would have been bound to be swallowed up by the masses of people turned mad by the pills. Now he only had one enemy left, Roland Wimbledon in the Western Territory. Chapter 266 Making Up Their Mind. Your Majesty, do you know why there isn't any news from my older brother? Ed's question surprised Timothy for a moment. Indeed, it had already been 2 months since he sent Lehman Hawes over to loot the Western Territory. No matter if he traveled further or decided to return, he should already have reported on this situation by now, or returned to King City. Although one of the missions given to Lehman was take as much control of the Western Territory as possible, Timothy thoroughly understood that after the 1,500 people took the pills they would become almost entirely useless. Wanting to only rely on them to occupy the Western Territory was a very unlikely situation, so the main mission was to seize Longsong Stronghold, loot the pills in the church, verify the details about the Duke's battle, then lastly go out to attack Border Town, thereby consuming some of Roland's strength. He had already used this trick to deal with Garcia, so it could be described as a well-tested tactic of his. Even in the case that he was unable to capture the Port of Clear Water, and his militia was wiped out during the attempt to eliminate the enemy, most of his knights would still be able to return safely. So as long as he assembled a group of useless people afterwards, they would be able to set out on an attack once again. But why is there absolutely no news about Lehman Hawes and his group of knights? Timothy opened his mouth and slowly said, maybe his return was delayed because of the attack on Border Town, or he may be on his way back by now. He knew that his reasoning was clearly quite weak, but he still did not want to tell Lehman's brother the most likely answer. Maybe when I get back to King City, there will be a message from him waiting for me. Then Your Majesty, at that time, is it possible that I can ask that you tell you the news? Timothy nodded. Of course, I will send a messenger to deliver it to you. Thank you, Your Majesty. The new king leant on the railing, watching the occasional rays of light which appeared within the black clouds. The sound of thunder came from a far-off place. It wasn't loud, but rather deep and resounding, as if it struck directly into the heart. Ed's question had caused the joy in Timothy's heart to largely fade away. If it was said that Garcia Wimbledon's rebellion was as it was meant to be, and that Tilly Wimbledon's departure had disappointed him greatly, then the action of Roland Wimbledon was something completely unimaginable to him. He had always thought that it would be absolutely unnecessary for him to spend any of his energy on his incompetent younger brother. As long as he waited for some time, Roland would become fed up with Border Town's impoverished lifestyle and come back to King City on his own. Thus today's very real situation was completely unimaginable. Staying behind so as to take care of Border Town, safely making it through the months of demons, defeating Duke Ryan to seize Longsong Strong, and I have now even completely lost contact with Lehman and his 1 foot 500 inches militia. In the end, how is this even possible? Timothy didn't have a deep understanding regarding his younger brother. In our childhood, no matter if it was Garcia or Gerald, they didn't love playing with him. Even after they became adults, they would only occasionally meet during the palace banquets. However, news related to his naughty and mischievous deeds never stopped. Even father wasn't fond of him. Is it possible that he concealed his true nature from the beginning? As soon as the idea came up, Timothy also rejected it. Even if he is as smart as Fifth Sister, it would only affect his learning ability and his reactive thinking. During Tilly's childhood, there wasn't any difference between her and an ordinary girl. How can someone be born with the knowledge on how to mask themselves and deceive others? It is inevitable that something must have happened after he had left for Border Town, which caused these changes. Timothy shook his head, and threw those distracted thoughts to the back of his mind. What's wrong, Your Majesty? No, it's nothing. The new king took a breath. A storm is coming. No matter what had happened to him, the situation is still the same. With Border Town's population and its position, he is already doomed without somewhere to retreat to. He has no port or fleet. And with only the unreachable barbaric wasteland behind him, he can only defend his small corner to the death, waiting until he is completely swept off by my attacks. Do you insist on leaving tomorrow? The knight asked in fear. Timothy turned around. If you stop after encountering some rain, what would you do when you meet a real storm? Sooner or later, Roland Wimbledon will kneel beneath my feet and beg for my forgiveness. I will inevitably put Greycastle's crown on my head. However, all of this is but a side act of a newly started play. The movements and intentions of the church are becoming increasingly obvious. One day, the church and Greycastle are bound to clash. That will be my real challenge. Go and attend to your own affairs. The sooner you are able to finish the task I've given you, the sooner you will be able to return to King City. As you bid, Your Majesty. Ed walked 2 steps away, but then turned back to ask. I almost forgot. May I ask Your Majesty, how do you wish to deal with those who swallowed the pills and haven't died on the battlefield? They have already taken the pills for the 3rd time. Have them burn along with Port of Clear Water, Timothy replied expressionlessly. After the knight acknowledged his orders and left, Timothy suddenly felt something cold on the tip of his nose. Lifting his head, he saw raindrops falling from the clouds. First there was only some spare droplets, but it became more and more dense, then setting off ripples over the sea's surface. Asterisk. The new holy city at Hermes was at the peak of the Tower of Babel. Damn it, truly, King damn it. Tayfun shouted as he vigorously smashed his fist against the table. This WH*re of AB*tch. That's blaspheme. She dares to point her spearhead at the church. This was the first time that Maine had seen the old bishop lose his self-control. The veins on his forehead had risen in his rage, and his beard was trembling. In general, his sinister appearance looked as if he wanted to swallow his counterpart. It was quite difficult to imagine that he was the same man as the man who constantly raised complaints regarding Heather, who could not exchange even a few words with her without quarreling the whole afternoon long. However, the moment he saw the content inside the small jewel box sent from the Queen of Clear Water, the old man had burst into a rage. There had been no pearl in the small jewel box, it had only contained a single cast iron ring, the bishop's emblem that had personally been awarded by His Holiness, and it was still attached to a blood-stained finger. Maine sighed, then reached out for the jewelry box. Of course she dares, that's because we also haven't received the blessing of God. God only favors the victorious. Hearing this sentence, Tayfun suddenly calmed down, then silently went to sit back in his chair, heavily gasping for air, before he was once more able to stiffly ask, then, what do you intend to do? This was indeed a situation the church hadn't encountered in the last 100 years. No one had thought that Garcia would come the whole way up from Greycastle to the Kingdom of Endless Winter, and even send the Black Sail fleet towards Hermes after having seized the capital. Although the Wolf-Shark Kingdom had been on its last breath before being conquered, Maine still hadn't hesitated to order the God's Punishment Army to come back to the old holy city. This city, even without any walls, was the barrier defending the base under Hermes, and they couldn't afford to lose it no matter the price. After they repelled their offensive, the Black Sail fleet didn't try to go on and instead returned along the river all the way back to King City of Endless Winter. The other's intention was quite obvious. As long as the church dispatched troops attack the Wolf-Shark Kingdom, Garcia would attack the old holy city from the river. Furthermore, the nobles who had previously been suppressed by the sudden loss of Endless Winter's royal power would now begin to stir. Maine believed that as long as Garcia promised that they could keep their territories and possessions, all those greedy nobles wouldn't hesitate to support Garcia to become the new queen of Endless Winter. Now they had a dilemma which couldn't be easily settled. But the church would not bow just because they were facing a difficult situation. Even before he had become an archbishop, Maine had already known that the road before him would be a long and thorny one. First, the holy city needs to announce a new archbishop, so we will first make a list of possible candidates. The final candidate is to be decided by His Holiness, Maine slowly stated. And the enemy? Tayfun snorted from his nostrils. I will explain everything to His Holiness, do not worry. He closed his eyes. His Excellency will execute a holy judgment on them. Chapter 267 The Fated Ending. Maine passed through the gloomy corridors before he rode the hanging cage into the depths, arriving at the secret temple inside the gigantic cavity. His Excellency O'Brien was already waiting at the doorway. He seemed to have aged since the last time he'd seen him. He had wrinkles spreading out like a spider web from the corners of his inwardly sunken eyes and over his cheeks. However, his smile was still just as soft and filled with concern. Maine couldn't keep his eyes from becoming wet at the sight. He quickly sunk to his knees. "Your Holiness, we dash. Rise, child." The Pope's voice was both gentle and calm. "I've heard that you've run into some trouble. Follow me to the hall and we can talk." Today wasn't the day of conversion, so the hall's walls weren't decorated with as many candles as stars in the sky this time. Instead, only a few candles had been placed over in the corner. The Pope returned to his lord's seat, breathing out in relief after he Saturday explained just what happened outside. Maine fully realized the heaviness of His Holiness O'Brien's responsibility. It wasn't that His Holiness couldn't find out news from outside of the Holy City, simply that he did not have enough time to pay attention to trivial matter. As a result of this, the 3 archbishops were then established, and would coordinate themselves to manage all of the religious affairs, making sure that they avoid bothering His Holiness with their matter as much as possible, but the current troublesome situation was something he was unable to solve by himself. Maine sharply began to narrate the matters at hand, one piece of news at a time from beginning to end. "Heather is dead." After listening to everything, O'Brien remained silent for a very long time, then released a long sigh before saying, "She possessed a keen sense of observation and she was both a clever and devout little girl. I've seen her as she slowly grew up." "Feel free to grieve, Your Holiness. The murderer must be punished." The Pope nodded. "How is the current situation? Are Garcia and the Wolf Shark Kingdom mutually helping each other? Isn't the new poison showing any effect?" During the attack and capture of the Broken Tooth Castle, it already showed its effect. After a month passed, all of the stronghold's defenders had fallen dead, and the army of judges could quickly storm the city. They were unable to find almost any living soul within the residential areas. However, for the attack on Wolfshart City, it seems the poison wasn't able to have the same influence and the enemy still remains tenaciously resistant. Maine reported. "You made 2 mistakes," O'Brien slowly said. "The disease caused by the poison will lead to death within 7 to 10 days. You should have taken advantage of the illness' first appearance to attack, then quickly rescued and given medical treatment to the residents inside the city. This would have significantly reduced their hostility. Do not forget that what we need the most is to get as much of the population as possible, not a ghost city. The second point is that you waited 1 month until you attacked. Although by doing it in this way, you were able to reduce the casualties to a minimum, you also gave the enemy enough time to respond, which allowed them enough time to find a way to cure the disease. The essence of the new poison was the magic to transform demonic beasts. According to what the canon of magic says, there are more than 70 kinds of abilities that can restrain the infections, and also more than 30 types which can exterminate it. In the end, it isn't surprising for there to be such a witch within a city filled with tens of thousands of people. You mean, they colluded with witches? In the end, when facing a life and death crisis, no one will care whether they are the devil's minions or not, the Pope muttered. No matter if those witches took the initiative to come out by themselves, or if they were unmasked and forced to treat the plague, both possibilities sound like bad news for the Church. If they really can stop the momentum of our attack, it is inevitable that the witch's reputation is bound to undergo some dramatic changes, even so far, that they could be regarded as heroes. "This is all my fault," Maine said while lowering his head. "It certainly was a mistake, but not a grave one. The reason you used this tactic was to reduce the losses of our army of judges and God's punishment army." O'Brien used his scepter to knock Maine on the shoulder. "Furthermore, the fact that Greycastle's 3rd Princess Garcia and the Wolfshark Kingdom are working together is also an opportunity for us." Port Unity?" the bishop asked shocked. "That's right. This way we will have the opportunity to catch everything in one net." O'Brien stood up. "You, come with me." Escorted by guards, Maine followed the Pope out of the pivotal secret institution, and they slowly walked further into the depths of the cave. The gloomy rays of light coming from the immense god's punishment stones illuminated the path beneath their feet, gradually, becoming darker and darker, until Maine was no longer able to keep himself from looking back, only to see that the pivotal secret temple and the god's punishment stone was already great distance behind them. In the end, it even became necessary for the guards to light up torches to prevent them from stumbling over the rubble that was on the ground. "We are going where?" "We are already there, child." His Holiness O'Brien halted his footsteps, breathing a bit hurriedly. Sigh. "I'm getting old. From just this short journey, I have already expended such a large amount of effort." A guard came up to support him. "Your Holiness, please permit me to carry you." "That's not necessary, a short break will be good enough." After saying this, the Pope stood in place and tried to catch his breath. He then commanded, "Light the brazier." At this moment the bishop noticed that there were a few tall towers erected beside the stone road, but if the guards with their torches hadn't stepped close to them, it would have been hard for the average person to find these hidden metal towers within the darkness. The guards climbed the ladders and lit the oil in the basin at the top. It immediately produced several groups of dazzling flames. Maine first had to narrowly squint his eyes and slowly adapt to the change in lighting, before he was able to look ahead. In the flickering light, a dusty canvas appeared in front of everyone. It was tall and bulging, and was apparently covering a something large. "It was originally planned that we would wait 2 more years before we took this out to help resist against the then even more fierce demonic beast's attacks, but it now seems we have to shift its appearance to an earlier date." O'Brien waved his hand, then commanded, "Remove the cloth." When the canvas fell, Maine couldn't believe his eyes. Before him stood a huge, fearsome 4-wheeled iron carriage. Just its wheels were already taller than he was. It did not have the appearance of an ordinary carriage either. Rather, it had a ferocious-looking horn-shaped metal ramp. The frame was made out of beast bones, and the areas between the frames had been closed with barbed bone shields, with a size of 3 to 4 large doors. There were 2 perfectly straight iron poles with pointed ends, one on the left and one on the right, which extended through the openings in the shield and pointed forward, as if ready to fire off arrows. Moreover, another dozen of these metal poles were hanging from both sides of the iron carriage. Each were as thick as his own thigh, with its dark and metallic luster shining under the brazier light. The canon called this siege beast. The Pope walked to the side of the carriage and patted the hard iron poles. "It relies on magic power to operate, and needs the power of 3 to 4 witches for it to run smoothly. The siege beast's striking distance is far beyond that of a trebuchet or ballista, and for the typical city wall, it is very difficult to resist the destructible power of these iron arrows. The giant trees they use to build ships with are the same as thin pieces of paper in front of this. No matter if it is for destroying the strong city walls of Wolfshart City or to prevent the Black Sail fleet from advancing further, would both be very easy if we make use of this." Is it also a weapon developed by the secret temple?" "No," O'Brien shook his head. "You should be able to guess. This comes from our enemies. It is from the devils from hell. This is also why the church hides the siege beast here deep within the cave. Remember, when you use it, be sure to hide your whereabouts as much as possible. Don't let any civilians see it." "I understand," Maine said as he lowered his head. "How it is possible for witches to be able to manipulate the devil's weapon? Do they possess the same kind of magic as humans?" He forced down all of his doubts and did not continue asking. Obviously, only after he became the new pope would he be eligible to understand these things. "Also, to avoid Garcia and the Wolf King from fleeing again, I will be dispatching 2 purified ones to aid you during combat," the Pope said. "No one can escape from their grasp. Go forth, bring back the blood of those blasphemers for the sake of Heather's farewell dinner. His Holiness is dispatching the purified ones." He was shocked to his core. The witches who were both raised and allowed to survive by the church were called purified ones. But to become His Holiness' subordinate, only the most powerful out of 10,000 was selected, like those who had abilities not even recorded within the canon of magic. Comparing them to the troops under Heather, Tayfun, and himself, would be like comparing the sky to the earth. With His Holiness now personally stating that they would be unable to escape, the ending of the 2 was already fated to happen. As you bid, Your Holiness, Maine answered in excitement. Chapter 268 The First Plenary Session, Part 1. Roland held Border Town's first high-level plenary session in the castle's drawing hall. Compared to the time when he had held it with Berev and his 10 apprentices in name only, the city hall nowadays had expanded to a large group consisting of nearly 100 people. The group contained nobles, surrendered knights, squires, as well as some natives who had completed the primary education and received their diploma. Thanks to the growth of the population, various departments could be formed in succession, which caused the city hall to finally reach a size the prince was satisfied with. No longer was it as before, where he had to do everything on his own. At present, in the case of a simple policy or program, as long as he explained the concept to them, the new city hall was able to distribute it according to the department and managed to complete the task, something which filled Roland with a sense of gratification. The participants of the first high-level meeting were all the heads of departments, namely there was the Minister of Agriculture, Sirius Daly, Minister of Education, Scroll, the Minister of Chemical Industry, Kyle Seachy, Temporary, Minister of Construction, Carl Van Bate, the head of the Army, Iron X, and finally, the City Hall Premier Minister, Berev Mons. The Ministry of Industry was still personally managed by Roland. After all, except him, no one else knew what industrialization looked like. A bucket of ice water was placed next to everyone, releasing bursts of cold air. Candle had placed an enchantment on the ice cubes, which preserved them within the water for at least the whole morning. Even though the sun was shining fiercely outside, the castle hall still maintained its cool and refreshing temperature. Then let's start with each department reporting on its recent situation. Roland took a kettle from the bucket and poured himself a cup of ice water. The first one is the Ministry of Agriculture. Yes, Your Royal Highness, Sirius answered. He stood up and saluted, then spread out a roll of paper he had prepared in advance. Currently we have acquired around 17,000 hu of grain, which is already enough to satisfy the townsfolk until next year's last month of summer. In addition, the Ministry of Agriculture has, according to your request, also purchased the surplus grains in accordance to the market value. However, this amount is far less than the amount we've gained. For now, it is only accounts for 4 feet 500 inches hu. The so-called hu was a commonly used wheat weighing unit during ancient times, measured by using a deep basket made out of thin bamboo. Therefore, even after he heard these numbers, he still didn't know how he was supposed to convert them into kilograms or liters. Fortunately, this wasn't the important point. The crucial point was that they had enough food to feed all of the townsfolk. The critical fact laid in the second aspect: if the Ministry of Agriculture took 7/10, it would mean that the serfs had 3/10 which they could sell themselves and accumulated to 7,000 hu. But the discrepancy was much larger than the amount of grain needed to set aside as foodstuff and seeds for the next year. In other words, some serfs had not sold the remaining 30% of the food to the city hall and instead chosen to hoard it in wooden sheds. Although he had already anticipated a situation such as this beforehand, seeing it turn out this way still caused him to let out a gentle sigh. Their purpose in hoarding the grain was apparent. They were speculating to resell it at a profit later. For example, if Border Town gave birth to a food shortage, or was struck by a natural disaster, they would be able to sell the food at prices much higher than the market price. An increase of 10 times wouldn't be impossible. This was also the reason why Roland had decided that the city hall would hold a monopoly over the grain transaction, and also why the buyer must first show their identity card. The grain operation was related to Border Town's stability. In case the grain transaction was unable to create a surplus during the early period and the sale wasn't restricted, it would likely lead to speculators acquiring and hoarding the food and in that way artificially increasing the food's price. However, by using a system of limited sales and only selling to people who had an ID, while at the same time stopping any other sales channels, Roland was able to keep the food price at a steady position. Your Highness, why don't you force the serfs to sell their grain? Sirius asked, puzzled. In any case, it's not like the law permits them to give it to other people. Because the grain is their property, how they choose to handle it is their choice, Roland replied. I never set a rule not allowing the serfs to hold on to their own food. You can also understand it as long as it isn't prohibited, it is allowed. On hearing his reply, Sirius looked somewhat puzzled by it, apparently not knowing how he was supposed to interpret this sentence. And he wasn't the only one confused, most of the others were also frowning. The only exception to this was Berev, who was currently showing a thoughtful expression. Is there anything else to report? Roland drank a mouthful of iced water. Only with time would they be able to understand the concept of emphasizing rules and procedure. Or putting it another way, the moment they were able to comprehend it, they could be regarded as a new generation of qualified officials. Of course, this could also easily lead to another extreme, like the emergence of bureaucracy. However, bureaucracy was still better than confusion, disorder, and people behaving unscrupulously. Yes, Sirius Daly flung his head back. Now that the fields have been harvested, I do not know how to organize next year's fallow and plow plan. No, the serfs can endlessly cultivate their lands, so we will continue to plant wheat next year. Roland waved his hand. Those piles of manure to the side of the fields were gathered in preparation of fertilizing the land. In the following days, you will start to instruct the serfs to shovel it into the fields, and fully mix it into the soil, completely clear it and make place for new piles of excrements. With the summer's high temperature and humid weather, it had only needed 2 months before becoming well-rotted compost. However, during the winter season it will usually take 4 months. So by the beginning of spring of next year, not only would the soil's quality be increased by the first batch of compost, but Roland would also have readied a second batch of compost which could be used as base fertilizer. Because of this, there was no need for a fallow plan. Not speaking about high-end fertilizer, just using humans' and animals' excrement as fertilizer was already a vast improvement for the agriculture. Well, if this is what you order. He touched his head, also. Your Highness, I'm afraid that with such large amounts of wheat it won't be enough to only lean on 1 or 2 stone grinding mills. So, I want to apply for the construction of a mill next to the Redwater River, preferably a steam-powered one. That's pretty good, Roland nodded. This was a new breakthrough. There was finally someone other than himself who wanted to try and use the new power. First of all, you should forward your plan to Berev, and after obtaining the funding for it, you then have to determine a detailed plan together with the Ministry of Construction. All right, Your Highness. Sirius agreed. The last point is regarding the promotion to freed people. At present, 516 people have obtained the qualification for the promotion. Because the amount of wheat was divided and transferred on the spot, no one has put up any objections. I have already reported the list to Lord Berev. Then he got up and saluted again. That concludes my report. Well done. Roland clapped twice to show his encouragement. It seemed that the former young knight of the Wolf family had not only adapted to his new life in Border Town, but also obtained the manners of the city hall. And so, could be turned into an excellent propaganda model after a little packaging, in that way playing a small role in attracting nobles or knights of Longsong Stronghold in the future. The second to give their report was Scroll. She had tied her long hair to the back of her head, and wore a clean and tidy white shirt, matched with a simple and decorate-free black long skirt, which made her look both mature and capable. Seeing her today, it was hard for him to imagine that half a year ago, she was still a witch living in exile so as to hide away from the church. At present, there are 2 batches of people who are in the process of completing their primary education, a total of 85 people. Most of them previously studied at the college run by Mr. Carl. With her ability to have a highly retentive memory, she had no need to prepare any data for the report beforehand, a point which made Roland feel very envious. 46 of them choose to go to work in the city hall, 21 people decided to go to the bicycle factory, 13 people decided to join the First Army. Pausing for a moment she continued, there are also 5 applicants for a post at the chemical laboratory. 5 people? Roland could not help but look over towards Kyle Sichi, merely to see the latter's complexion clearly didn't appear to be that good. It seems that the propaganda effect of the honor and award ceremony is far less than I expected. I'm afraid that some parts of the 3 recently created laboratories are going to have to lie idle in the near future. Fortunately, the employment rate is at least at 100%, Roland tried to comfort himself. Chapter 269 The First Plenary Session, Part 2. When it was the Ministry of Chemical Industry's turn, Kyle snorted, "Your Royal Highness, I hope you can find the real head of this department as soon as possible. I do not want to attend this kind of meeting for a second time." Roland secretly rolled his eyes. After becoming a leader, he had discovered that it was important for him to selectively ignore words sometimes. Is it that easy to find a person who has talent for both alchemy and chemistry? Do you have any idea how to mass-produce the two acids? No, Kyle shrugged his shoulders, and because of that, I have to spend more energy and staff on researching this topic, so rather than sitting here and wasting my time. After spending such a long time in Border Town, he had also acquired some of Roland's vocabulary. In case you insist that I should give an account, I can only say that the laboratory is lacking personnel. The more people that come to us, the better. In addition, regarding the recently 5 added people, although they aren't as old, they can still be counted as clever. It seems that the primary education you implemented is still somewhat useful. Well, the person with the most disrespectful way of talking was probably the chief alchemist. However, taking each other's age into account, and the degree of enthusiasm he showed for chemical experiments, Roland did not feel any resentment towards him for this. It was also important to remember that after going through the explosion and after being completely healed by Nana, his first and largest reaction was that he was glad that he could now conduct experiments without the slightest of scruple, and then even plan to taste the different flavors of the acids. Who other than he would have such a fanatical enthusiasm to their work? Alright, you will continue to research, and I'll have Barav think of a method to fill in the staff shortage. Oh, by the way, Your Highness, Kyle opened his mouth again. Were you able to compile your intermediate chemistry? If you could give me some details, maybe I can think of a method for the large-scale production earlier. I already said at the honor and award ceremony, so long as you train enough apprentices and assistants to fill the new laboratories, I will give you the book, Roland said, spreading his hand out towards him. In fact, at present, he had not written even the first line. Just the elementary chemistry had already consumed all his knowledge of chemistry. He already feared that even if he racked his brain for it, he would still be unable to fill more than a few pages of the intermediate chemistry. The fourth person to report was Carl van Bate, who was from the Ministry of Construction. First of all, I want to thank Miss Scroll, Carl said, as he nodded towards Scroll. I'm really glad to hear that the children I've taught were able to graduate smoothly. Compared to the chief alchemist, the stonemason's communication skills could be said to be as different as the sky to the earth. Scroll nodded in return before replying with, I should be the one thanking you. Then Carl opened the records he was carrying with him and in a methodical manner began to describe. At present, the town's projects are steadily advancing. The main projects are the Kingdom Avenue, the Redwater Bridge, the new residential area and the new city wall. The amount of people working on the construction of the Kingdom Avenue has already reached 4,500 people. Half of them have come from Longsong Stronghold and according to current predictions, they should be finished by spring next year. Regarding the status of the Redwater Bridge, currently they are still carrying out the construction of the underground concrete wall. The residential district is already extending to the old city wall, and there are currently approximately 1,000 people busy constructing it. As long as the supply of the cement and bricks are ensured, it should be possible to complete the task of moving all the eastern refugees into town before the arrival of the months of demons. Since Carl usually informed Roland on a daily basis about the recent developments of the projects, his report this time was very simple. He didn't even mention matters such as the expansion of the castle area and the construction of the witch dorm. And after deciding on a good position for the new city wall, it was being constructed by Lotus herself, with a daily progress of approximately 100 meters. You've worked hard, Roland nodded. The Ministry of Construction, regardless of whether it was the staff or the amount of allocated funds, was the department with the largest amounts. Therefore, its achievements were also the greatest. Those handymen coming from Longsong Stronghold, besides speeding up the construction, they are also promoting Border Town's preferential treatment policy. Furthermore, after a year of work, those handymen can be regarded as qualified craftsmen, and so the number of people who want to go back should be kept to as little as possible. Yes, Your Royal Highness, Carl agreed. Then the next one is Iron Axe. It was Iron Axe's first time participating in this kind of meeting, and so he seemed to be a little out of place. He cleared his throat. "Your Royal Highness, the army has two main things it wishes to report. First of all, the Second Army has completed their basic training, and they are now ready to be sent to the Longsong stronghold. And secondly, in the wake of adding new blood, the First Army now has 825 people. Putting aside the 350 people of the artillery team, the rest of the soldiers have all been equipped with revolving rifles. That's all I have to say." Then finished his report with a military salute. "That sounds pretty good. Have the Second Army set out tomorrow and be sure to place reliable people at the important ranks. After reaching the stronghold, they aren't allowed to stop their daily training and ideological education. Furthermore, I expect a weekly report to be sent back to Border Town," Roland instructed. The last to report was Berev. He first looked at everyone, then slowly saluted Roland before reporting, "Your Royal Highness, ever since the previous payment to Margaret's Chamber of Commerce for the refugee transportation and the money spent on Theo's mission, the City Hall's gold stock has declined very badly. Coupled with the bumper harvest and the Ministry of Agriculture's acquisition of grain according to the set market price, it has resulted in an inventory of barely 2,000 gold royals. This can be considered as a relatively dangerous boundary. 2,000 gold royals, compared with last year's winter, it undoubtedly was a huge sum of money, but Roland was also perfectly aware that Border Town's situation was also no longer the same as it was back then. Even just for the Ministry of Construction, already burdened Border Town with the huge expenditure of paying for the 5,000 workers. There was also the high salary for the First Army, factories, chemical laboratory, and City Hall, which also required a large amount of money. In other words, Border Town might have been earning money quickly, but it was also spending the money just as quickly. Even under the circumstances that large parts of the materials and machinery were self-sufficient. I am aware of this, but at the beginning of next month, when Margaret's caravan arrives in town, we will be able to obtain a huge income through the sale of the steam engines, Roland responded. Furthermore, the purchase of food and the transport of the refugees aren't daily expenses. I'm sure that during the next 6 months, the Treasury should be able to improve steadily. There is no reason for you to worry too much about it." He paused. "Also, I plan to raise the salary of everyone here." "Raise the salary?" Berev got startled and stared blankly at Roland. "That's correct, the City Hall is no longer an institution only run by a dozen people, and your workload has increased significantly, so your salary will also naturally rise." The prince smiled and then continued to say, "From this month onwards, I will increase your monthly salary to 5 gold royals, and according to this ratio, the payment for your apprentices and assistants will also go up uniformly. Be at ease, the needed fund doesn't accumulate too much, it is not more than 20 to 30 gold royals." Although a salary of 5 gold royals for this kind of position in the City Hall couldn't be counted as generous, but Roland knew that what Berev enjoyed even more than the salary was being in charge of Border Town's revenues and expenditure and providing them with the according statistics. Furthermore, since he had yet to set any regulatory ministries, Berev could get 100 times his current salary. But so far, he had not seen any signs of corruption from Berev. Of course, apart from relying on the other people's conscience, Roland could also always count on Nightingale's ability to maintain the department's integrity. No one could conceal their bad behavior from her gaze. "In addition, there is one thing you may already know," Roland continued. "By the end of the months of demons, I plan to officially establish a city here. In other words, Border Town will be upgraded into an official city. The city's west side will stretch until the barbarian wasteland, the eastern border will be Longsong stronghold, while the southern end will be the hills and the ocean. With the city walls and the mountains as a natural barrier, the area will be far larger than King City or any other city in the 4 kingdoms. So you still need to pay particular attention and improve your work, to meet the attitude that is required to establish a city." Roland paused and then emphasized every word, "I hope that our city, even while in a boundless winter, can stay as warm as during spring." Chapter 270 High Pressure Air Bottle. After the meeting concluded, Roland and Berev both stayed behind. You also saw it. Currently people are crucial to the chemical laboratory and Grey Castle industry, and I also intend on starting the mass production of soap and perfume soon, which will require a lot of additional staff. The prince said. But it will be at least a year before the greater part of the townsfolk pass the primary education examination. Furthermore, even by taking all of them into account, there still won't be more than 600 to 700 people. That just isn't enough. I need more people. In case we enlist people from the stronghold. No, Roland interrupted. Next year, after Border Town has upgraded to the status of a city, the stronghold and Border Town will be fused into one entity. Therefore, it would be the equivalent of the moving money out from your left pocket into your right pocket, so, I will need more people from outside the Western Territory. This, Berev looked somewhat troubled and worriedly suggested, I am afraid that isn't such a good idea to solve it. If you go to other cities to fish for workers, the local lords would definitely not sit by and idly watch as it happens. Do not go to the cities, Roland said. Then he stretched his finger toward the cup, dipped it into the iced water and then moved it over the table while saying, I don't know if you've noticed, but since the end of the months of demons, Grey Castle has constantly been at war. Including several charges which had been led by Timothy against the Southern Territory, resulting in Eagle City being destroyed from a fire, and leaving the surrounding cities and towns severely damaged. Then there was also the subjugation of the northern region, where they stripped the Duke Ise of his title and territory. And lastly the marine attack against the eastern region, he beat 2 times against the tabletop, leaving a group of water stains, which seriously impacted the Seawind region, Valencia, and Shivering Crow Castle, not even mentioning all the small towns in the surroundings. Just by looking at all the people who fled to King City you can already see how seriously the impact was on Grey Castle's population. What do you mean? Berev revealed a thoughtful expression. Go out and spread propaganda about the western region. The prince smoothed out the water then explained in more detail. During the last 6 months, only the western region remained peaceful. There has been no forced recruitment, nor has it been hit by the flames of war. Especially since Timothy so wantonly uses commoners to attack, he will definitely recruit and even force the civilians of each region. Who can guarantee that next time that fate won't fall on their head? So you have to propagandize that the only calm and peaceful place completely isolated from the chaos of war is the western region. I think I got it, Berev said after pondering about his next words. You plan to attract the civilians of other cities by not pressing them into service, or forcing them into labor, and furthermore, by providing them with shelter, food, and stable work? Almost, Roland said with a smile and nodded. His active thinking and ability to find the key points is one of the assistant minister's strongest points. However, one of the key points you need to propagandize is the excellent treatment that literate people will enjoy. I think that these places definitely have some knights and nobles who have no way out and because of this are unwilling to come to the western region to try their luck. Whether it was small villages or towns, they were almost all territories of minor nobility. And during peacetime, even if the land was small and barren, and the management poor, supervising a few acres of land would always manage to fill their stomach. But during the time of war, something which severely impacted the population, it was hard for them to survive. At those times, if there was a stable and peaceful destination for them, it would really prove tempting to most of them. Even if there was no one who could safeguard their territory and keep it from being occupied by others, they would only have to endure these days of war. Afterward, they could use their money to recruit some mercenaries and go back to take over their territory once again. As for how to advertise, Roland believed that Berev would have his ways. But Your Highness, by doing it this way and helping the personnel to settle down will be very expensive. Furthermore, the acquisition of the grain cannot be interrupted, Berev hesitantly said. In case the caravan encounters some accidents, the city hall's treasury will quickly dry up. What you've said sounds reasonable. Roland touched his chin. The most important task of new established political powers was to create trust and confidence of it within the people's hearts. If they were suddenly caught in a situation where they were unable to pay their salary, this current excellent situation would take a sudden turn and rapidly worsen. Well, in this case, you should head back first and continue with your usual task. We will wait until the caravan has arrived in border town and the completion of the transaction next month. When the treasury is filled once more, we will speak about the implementation of the plan again. As you bid, Your Royal Highness, Barrack placed his hand on his chest. After finishing the mission briefing, Roland returned to his office and began thinking about how to complete Margaret's balloon order. With a price of 1,000 gold royals for each balloon, its price was even higher than that of the steam engine, while its production cost was actually lower. The airbag was mainly a drawn picture by Soraya, while the hemp rope and bamboo basket were bargain-priced goods. In fact, Roland had already created a prototype and tested it in the factory courtyard, a hydrogen balloon which could carry Lighting and Maggie simultaneously and ascend into the sky. After repeated consideration, he finally decided to abandon the idea of a hot air balloon fueled by coal gas. The needed equipment would use up too much space, and the manufacturing process would also be very troublesome. Moreover, Roland would have to import that coal from other cities, which for a small-scale production would be extremely cost-ineffective, far inferior to hydrogen, which was so much easier to facilitate. He coated the test product with a single-sided water coating, which ensured that even after being burned, nothing would happen to the paper. As a result, the whole air sac had hardly any weight, while its flexibility was very outstanding. In the experiment, after inflating the balloon, it would fear neither rain, impact, or fire. Maggie even turned into several kinds of birds to throw vicious attacks against the balloon, but it was still unable to leave even a small trace. Only by using an iron needle were they able to pierce through the millimeter-thick coating. And since the construction of the air sac was very live, a hydrogen balloon with merely a diameter of about 2 meters was already enough to carry an adult. The only difficulty laid in how they would solve the gasification problem of the high-pressure hydrogen bottle. Selling a DC motor for the electrolysis of water was impossible. A motor connected to a steam engine could inflate all hydrogen balloons, which was obviously not that cost-effective. If he wanted a steady flow of gold royals from the hands of the wealthy and powerful merchants, he would have to find a way of create high-pressure bottles which could be refilled repeatedly. The air bottle itself was not difficult to build. The usage of secondary material could be made up with the wall's thickness, thus using pig iron and wrought iron was good enough, and with Anna personally being the one to manufacture it, processing the bottle accurately also wouldn't be a problem. The critical point was in the fact that the later generations of air bottles had a pressure level of 20 MPa or higher. Wishing to reach that by relying on a bicycle pump was undoubtedly nothing but a fantasy. Even the help of 10 chelants wouldn't change this. He at least had to obtain a high-pressure pump. And having a high enough pressure inside the bottle wasn't enough if there wasn't a way to fill the hydrogen balloon with it later. The high-pressure air pump was divided into a piston compressor and a turbine compressor. The former belonged to the internal combustion engine technology tree, while the later fell under the scope of turbine engines. No matter what type he would try to research and develop, they would both be time-consuming and laborious projects. Until late in the afternoon, Roland finally came up with a simple solution, a simple self-inflating bottle. The inspiration for it came from a news article he had seen before. A street vendor had been selling hydrogen balloons and used a modified liquefied gas tank to store the hydrogen, which in the end resulted in an explosion. The cause of this laid in the problem that the peddler had used diluted sulfuric acid and aluminum to create hydrogen inside of the bottle, but hadn't correctly calculated the amount of reaction, which resulted in the issue that the pressure inside the tank had become too large and had broken the bottle. Thus, the self-inflating method was to pour diluted sulfuric acid and an active metal into the bottle so as to replace the hydrogen. The commonly used metal in laboratories was zinc, while the one used to create most of the hydrogen was aluminum. Both materials were not accessible during this era. So Roland still intended to use Lucy's power to dismantle iron and purify it into high iron. The problem of its slow reaction speed at room temperature could also be improved by using heat and enlarging the contact area, for example using thin iron pieces or iron powder, while an inner coating could resist the corrosion effect of the acid liquid that was inside the bottle. Thinking until here, he immediately drew a simple sketch on paper. In order to reduce the air leakage, the high-pressure bottle needed to be made as one whole piece, with only a raised threaded hole at the top, which could be screwed into a valve with a gas nozzle. By tightening up the mouthpiece after injecting the reactant, the continuously generated gas would have nowhere to go, which would result in that the pressure inside the bottle would reach a very impressive level. As long as they unscrewed the valve, the hydrogen would pour out directly into the airbag. And the refill process would also be quite convenient. After removing the gas nozzle and drying the remaining liquid over a stove, the ferrous sulfate crystals inside could be cleaned out before it could be refilled with new reactant. Taking into account that diluted sulfuric acid is also an alchemy product, the refill price obviously couldn't be set too low. With 50 gold royals for one charge, and after buying 10 charges get one free, Roland thought. Chapter 271 Elements. Kalsichi returned home after finishing the day's experiments. His wife had already baked flatbread, made him some mushroom soup, and poured him a glass of white wine. The latter two were both goods that were sold at the convenience market, especially this sort of huge white mushrooms, which were just like the words on the signboard described them as, "You won't find any fresher, or more fragrant delicacy." After one taste you too will discover this to be true. If you eat even one piece, you will find it difficult to forget its full and unique flavor. Of course, its price was also very alarming. One palm-sized mushroom required 1 silver royal. If it weren't for his good salary, Kyle would never be able to bear buying such an expensive food. But there were also a lot of other things similar to this, such as perfumed soap and mirrors. As long as one had enough money, their life in border town would be much more comfortable than that of an average noble. Roland was simply deep beyond measure. This was also the deepest of point he felt. After he finished the evening meal, his wife handed him a letter. "This is?" "The letter was delivered by the guard this afternoon. At that time you still hadn't returned from work," she answered, as she started to clean the tableware. "He said that it had apparently come from Redwater City." "Is that so?" Kyle asked as he entered his study. He cut open the seal using a knife, then removed the parchment before spreading it out. To his surprise, the first sentence was actually, "Dear respected mentor." Seeing that Chavez was the one that had sent the letter, he couldn't help but smile. He sat at his desk and began to read through it carefully. Initially, when Kyle left the Redwater City alchemic workshop, another alchemist named Capola had become the new chief. But that person had been narrow-minded, and after obtaining the crystal glass formula left behind by Kyle, he not only claimed towards the Lord that this was his and Kyle's work, he even excluded Chavez either intentionally or unintentionally from the alchemy experiment group. Within the letter, Chavez complained that this was perhaps because he wanted to borrow the idea of the double stone acid method from him, but in the end didn't want to announce the achievement to the other side. Nowadays, several other alchemists apparently had also begun to intentionally or otherwise shun Chavez, which caused Kyle to feel quite troubled. Kyle could roughly understand what those people must be thinking. Chavez was the youngest alchemist of the refining room, so many people still thought that it had only been by relying on luck and Kyle's appreciation for him as a discipline that he had been able to stand out of the crowd. But the chief alchemist could only snort disdainfully at that sort of view. Saltpeter and green vitriol were both everyday things, so why had it been Chavez and no one else who had discovered the double stone acid method? This point alone should already sufficiently explain this issue. Perception, memory, making assumptions without fear, and being diligent during experimentation were all indispensable elements. In the end, this young man's innate skill was even above his own. At the end of the letter, Chavez had attached 2 alchemic formulas, claiming they were 2 of his recently discovered acids he wished to share with his mentor. But even at the first glance, Kyle could see that the essence of these 2 formulas was just the creation of salt when acids and alkali react with one another. This was the kind of recipe he could write down dozens of times in a single breath. With a sigh, Kalsichi put the letter down and glanced at the elementary chemistry laying on his table. Everything had changed with His Highness and his so-called ancient books. If it hadn't been for them, he was afraid that he would still be the same as Chavez, still aimless, and bewilderedly wandering through the primal chaos, hoping to find some clay on the surface and still regard it as some kind of treasure. Taking the book, Kyle immediately went to the last page. It showed a table which was neatly divided into 100 square blocks. Every time he looked at the table, he couldn't help but get goosebumps all over his body and feel a hard-to-describe reverence and fear from within his heart. Every box had a small serial number in the upper left corner which without a miss arrived at 118 at the end. Beside the first two rows, the majority of the boxes were blank, except for some symbols in the middle. For example, 26, iron, 29, copper. The name of this table was Periodic Table of Elements. While holding the book in his trembling hands, the chief alchemist had asked Roland about the contents of those blank boxes, merely to receive the answer that they had originally been filled, but he was unable to remember them. If at that time the other party hadn't been His Royal Highness, he most likely would have taken the book and thrown it into the other's face. According to the records in the book, this table contained all existing elements on Earth. If there existed a canon of alchemy, there was no doubt that this would be the most dazzling chapter in the whole book. What scared him the most was the question, what type of person was able to draw such a chart? And if they had already done this before, what were alchemists then supposed to be regarded as? They seemed to be merely a gang of children sitting within the silt and piling up some rocks. Kyle suddenly thought of His Royal Highness' promise, in case he was also able to call Chavez over, and also pull over the group of recently recruited apprentices, maybe he would be able to fill those 3 new laboratories. In that way, his dream of laying his hands on the intermediate chemistry would become a reality. Thinking until here, he immediately took out a piece of white paper and began to write his response. In fact, at the meeting when His Royal Highness had asked him whether he had any clue relating to large-scale acid production, he hadn't told him the truth. Because the content was complex and lengthy, it would have been a waste of time doing so. The most important matter was that he still didn't know whether his program worked or not. After all, he had based his production method entirely on the elements and reaction principles written within the book. Compared with the previous alchemy test, this hypothesis was like a child's nonsensical mutterings in their sleep. Wanting to use materials he had never seen before, together with an unheard-of reaction method, to create something which seemed to have no similarity with the raw materials, only because they had the same type of element. But within Kyle's heart he still had a faint premonition. It felt like this method might actually be feasible. After all, within the previous hundreds of permutation experiments, there had not been one time where the book statement wasn't correct. With the initial plan concluded, the next step was for him to complete a full set of theoretical tests within the laboratory. Since His Highness had said that the industrial method could be used for large-scale production, it should also be possible to reproduce the results in the laboratory. Kyle soon finished the letter. He didn't waste any words on consoling Chavez, and instead straightforwardly told his previously marvelous discipline about alchemic knowledge that was both available and measurable. Kyle believed that there didn't exist any alchemist who was brimming with the interests of a wise man, that would let the opportunity to seek truth pass them by. After folding the letter, placing it into an envelope and sealing it with wax, Kyle could do nothing other than wait for the next day to give the message to a traveling salesman who wanted to deliver it. After all this, his line of sight once again moved to the periodic table. Thinking about those blank boxes which would never be filled again, Kyle felt as if his life no longer had any joy left to offer him. But fortunately, His Royal Highness had said one short phrase which had made his heart surge, and until today those words were still pacing back and forth within his ears. Don't put on that look. The periodic table arranges each element in a regular pattern according to an underlying law. You can fill it up by yourself. Regular pattern? Do you mean that those unknown elements can also be deducted, just like the derivation of an alchemical formula? That's right, even if you have never seen them before, you can still describe their appearance and characteristics. That rule, what is it? Do you want to know? It is written in the Intermediate Chemistry. Chapter 272 North Slope Mine. The further down into the mine, the more humid the environment became. Sylvie was holding up a torch and gingerly evading the drop of water falling towards her head as she led the group further into the mine. Even without any light, her eye of truth wasn't something that could be stopped by the darkness. Thus she merely used the torch to save her magic power. There is another fork in the road, Nightingale, who was walking at the front, said after she stopped. Which cave is this already? 23rd. After passing the first fork from the entryway, Lightning answered, as she took a look at the records. I hope this is the last one, Sylvie grumbled, then completely opened her magic eye. The left side spreads away from the mining area, there is no or there. The right side is the same. Lightning wrote down the results, then announced, in that case, those caverns were also the last gates we had to inspect. Come on, Nightingale said and went from the front to the end, leading everyone back. It didn't seem that her ability was as simple as invisibility. Sylvie could only see faint changes in Nightingale's magic power, but was ultimately unable to capture her figure or movement. According to Lightning's introduction, she was the strongest fighting witch. This may also be the reason why Roland had her to follow them. There were rumors that the mine had once been a nest for ancient monsters, and there had already been several events of miners going missing. Before their departure, His Highness had also told them several times that they had to be careful and that in case they couldn't determine the situation, they should first exit the mine and report back to him. However, Sylvie couldn't accept this as correct. There existed no monster which could escape the investigation of her magic eye. Even those animal corpses, and the twisting soft-bodied snakes within the walls were clearly visible to her. There were 4 people in the expedition team, herself, Nightingale, Lightning, together with a little girl called Lucia. Every time they found some minerals, she would convert them into a variety of debris, and after carefully classifying them she would put them into her pocket, which would later be handed over to His Royal Highness. Lightning was responsible for drawing the map of the mine, since in her own words, there didn't exist any adventure from which she could be excluded. Hearing her prideful speech, Sylvie couldn't help but think of the captain who was temporarily staying on Sleeping Island. The 23rd cave was at the lower level of the mining site and could actually be regarded as an enormously deep hole. After penetrating several hundred steps into the mountain, it divided into 3 paths again, and after following each to their end, they would once again split into several branches. However, since they were at the exterior area of the mining site, with only the rare possibility of find any veins, they had decided to end their exploration. Returning to the first fork, which Lightning had recorded as Gate of Life, Sylvie cast her ability to observe the 23rd cave and the circumstances of those 3 pathways. The further she spread the range of her Eye of Truth, the greater the magic consumption was, and the heavier the burden on her body. So she decided to observe one channel after another at each fork. Cave number 3, yes, there aren't any mining areas at the end of it. There are, she spent a moment frozen in shock, there are 5 branches, including one that seems to lead further downwards while also making a detour. Downwards? Lightning repeated. It is indeed like that, Sylvie confirmed while taking another look. It didn't take long until the slender downwards leading path turned around a corner and pointed straight back at the mine. When she tried to further explore along the road, her mind suddenly became flooded with a strong sense of dizziness which interrupted her contact with her magic eye. I think it may lead to a mineral deposit. But this interpretation was a bit far-fetched. The North Slope Mine's tangled and complicated cave system was clearly not something which had been artificially dug out. Furthermore, if she hadn't been specifically looking for ore, it would be unlikely she'd have discovered any unknown veins, even if they were hidden between 2 channels. If not for her Eye of Truth which was able to penetrate any obstacle, it would be simply impossible to find any minerals hidden behind rocks and under piles of mud. No matter what, let's immediately go and take a look, Nightingale said, and shrugged her shoulders. The group entered the cave behind the 3rd gate one after another, and about a quarter of an hour later they had already arrived at the end of the passage. There the tunnel divided itself into 5 like she had seen it. One among them was even so narrow that it was impossible for people to walk through, and so it could only be entered by crawling. However, the strange channel Sylvie had seen before was located in the middle of the 5, and its topography changed dramatically, almost forming a deep slope when compared with the place they were standing now. It seems as if it is going straight down, Nightingale said and held up the torch. I feel as if this grotto is somewhat similar to the deep cliff of the impassable mountain range. Let's quickly finish the inspection, then immediately turn back, Lucia said in fright as she instinctively grasped onto Nightingale's arm. I do not like it here. I constantly feel as if something is staring at us from within the cave. There is nothing in the cave, except for mud and stone, Sylvie said. Even though she didn't like this quiet and moist place, her ability still told her that there was no danger. The four on the left and right all contain no ore and are leading further away from the mining site. She quickly finished the inspection of the leveled side roads, then moved her line of sight towards the front, only to immediately lose focus and release a faint, "Ah? What's going on?" Lightning asked. "I am unable to see the circumstances further down." "You cannot see it?" The little girl asked in disbelief. "Can it be that you are too tired and so your ability just don't work?" "No, my ability doesn't have any problems," Sylvie said and closed her eye, before opening it again, only to see that everything still remained dark, the same as if she had completely lost her vision. Enduring the oncoming headache, she tried to expand her field of vision further, but the results still remained the same, while the surrounding soil became clearly discernible. Only the pass in the middle was enveloped in complete darkness, which was as thick as ink. "There seems to be something which obstructs my peeking. You will all wait over here and don't leave," Nightingale ordered while simultaneously drawing her two shining silver weapons. "I will go in to explore the situation and immediately come back afterward." "Do not go," Sylvie shouted, grasping her forehead in pain. "There exists only one thing that can produce such an effect. Even if you go, you will be in danger." "What is it?" "God's Stone of Retaliation," Sylvie said through clenched teeth. "There is a God's Stone of Retaliation underground, and it is covering that whole region." When Roland heard the news, he immediately mobilized soldiers of the First Army and led them into the North Slope mine. And the result of their inspection confirmed Sylvie's guess. They discovered a large amount of God's Stone of Retaliation at the bottom of the deep hole. After determining that there was no danger, Roland also entered cave number 23 with the protection of his personal guards. He wished to see for himself how the God's Stone of Retaliation at the bottom of the mine looked like. "Your Highness, please be careful," Carter reminded him once more. "The exit is directly in front of us." "You are unable to use your magic here," Roland said while looking back at Anna, Nightingale, and Lightning standing behind him. "Didn't you learn it from Sylvie? Even without magic, I will still be stronger than you." "If you can go, I, of course, can also go," Nightingale said disapprovingly. "Wherever there is an adventure, I will also be there," Lightning announced while puffing out her chest. Anna, however, didn't say anything. She merely stared straight into Roland's eyes. Seeing the flickering flame from the torches in her clear eyes, Roland knew that regardless what he said it would prove to be useless. "All right," he sighed. "But you must stay by my side and don't move too far." Coming to the end of the slope, Roland immediately understood the meaning of the Chief Knight's words. Suddenly his eyes became filled with light, and a vast and deep cavern then appeared in front of him. Even without the aid of torches, he could still clearly see the whole cave since it was illuminated by the crystal prism like God's Stone of Retaliation. He could see some majestic towers rising straight from the ground, with a diameter of 20 to 30 meters at the base, which seemed similar to some very large neon towers. Chapter 273, God's Stone of Retaliation. Roland roughly estimated the size of the underground cave. The area below was almost the size of a football field, and was surrounded by steep mountain walls. The road connecting it with the other cave started in the middle of one of those mountain walls, and next to the tunnel entrance he could see a narrow stone staircase, which extended straight towards the bottom. "I guess the staircase wasn't cut out by you," Roland said while he squatted down and brought his torch near the ground. In the torchlight, he could clearly see marks carved out by knives and axes, with piles of dust and rock bits that were within the notches. "Of course not, Your Highness. At the time we discovered the cave, the stone steps had already existed," Carter said and shrugged his shoulders. "I guess they must have already been here for decades. Or since hundreds of years," Anna suddenly spoke. "I think so too," Lightning nodded in agreement. "It is only 70 years since Border Town has been established. It is unlikely for the stone staircase to be related to the locals here or even the kingdom. There were already some people living in the Western Territory several hundred of years ago?" Carter questioned. Grey Castle hadn't even existed back then. Roland patted the knight's shoulder. 450 years ago, there existed a group of people who have already been forgotten by history. Then he lifted the torch and said, "Let's go down and take a look." 20 to 30 soldiers of the First Army were already standing at the center of the cave, so he took the knight and the witches then went next to one of the god's punishment stones without delay. Only when he stood at the edge of this stone pillar was he finally able to realize how huge this actually was. Even by extending his arms as far as he could, he still wasn't able to surround even a tenth of it. He lifted his head and looked at the top. The tallest pillar made out of God's stone of retaliation already came close to 30 meters, which was almost equivalent to the height of an 8 or 9-story building, and was shining in an ominous purple light. In theory, stones could emit light either by having a radioactive material, or by containing some fluorescent components. But, the rays of light emitted by the God's stone of retaliation obviously had nothing to do with any of these possibilities. The light from the former was from the ionization in the air as the elements decayed. Furthermore, the shorter the half-life, the greater the brightness would be. But according to these very words and taking the stone's brightness into account, the soldiers who had already entered the cave for several minutes would have died from ionization radiation by now. While the latter possibility would need an external light to shine on it, but there was no light source here at the bottom of the mine, which could support it enough to send out the light continuously. Roland also noted that although the God's stone of retaliation had a crystal's commonly seen prism shape, its surface didn't have the veined pattern that came from crystals, but was instead as smooth as glass. The church sells a thumb-sized piece of a God's stone of retaliation for several gold royals. However, a piece of this magnitude, it is something impossible to acquire even after emptying the vaults of the entire 4 kingdoms. Carter couldn't stop himself from lamenting. "You want to give it to the nobles to slaughter witches?" Nightingale asked with a fierce glare. This isn't what I meant," the chief knight answered quickly, while unconsciously moving out from her line of sight. "It is the first time that I have seen God's stone of retaliation shine in these colors. Shouldn't they be transparent white?" Lightning curiously looked at the pillars. "In case you take them back with you, won't it be unnecessary to use a candle in the evening?" "I'd rather bring a candle into an already stuffy room filled with dozens of candles, than use this for light," Nightingale murmured while placing both her hands on her chest. "For us witches, they are a prison cage, the stocks and chains that are held by the church. If the world didn't have these damnable stones, it would be better off." "Oh, Sister Nightingale, you couldn't read a sentence in the evening anyway." The little girl licked her lips, picked up a stone from the ground and looked at Roland. "Can I take a piece of it back with me as my spoils of adventure?" Roland nodded. "If you don't hate these kind of things." She held a stone and raised her arm into the air and swung it towards the stone pillar. It smashed against the edge of the prism, only to hear a ting as the stone in her hand splintered while the prism showed not even the slightest scar. Seeing this, Carter shouted in shock, "What's going on? Shouldn't the God's stone of retaliation be fragile?" "Perhaps it is because this chunk is shining differently." Lightning threw the remaining stone chips in her hand away and took a dagger out of her waist purse. However, even after a good deal of tossing around the prism, with all kinds of scraping and cutting, it was still to no avail. Feeling that something was wrong, Roland looked at Nightingale and said, "You try it." The latter merely nodded, took out her revolver, aimed directly at the prism, then pulled the trigger. Immediately followed by an enormous echo splitting the silence in the cave, and the birth of some sparks at the impact area of the God's stone of retaliation. After the smoke cleared, the group walked over to the stone, merely to discover that the bullet wasn't even able to do anything more than leaving a small stain on the God's stone of retaliation's surface. This suggested that the durability of these intensely shining stones already exceed that of homogenized steel plates. "Even the gun is useless?" Carter asked with a frown. "In the end, how is the church able to cut a piece off and sell it?" No one could answer this question, causing everyone's expression to cloud up. Even Roland had been able to use his own force to break the God's stone of retaliation, like that time he'd broken the necklace around Anna's neck for instances. Just 2 or 3 pulls from him had been enough to turn the pure and limpid stone into a pile of white dust. But at this moment, Anna, who had been silent until now, suddenly opened her mouth. "Your Highness, do you still remember the treasure map that Ferlin Eltec had drawn?" "Treasure map?" Roland asked, confused. He could vaguely remember that there was a triangle occupying more than half of the drawing. One of the three edges pointed at the holy city Tequila, one at the stone tower in the concealing forest and one at the foot of the northern sloped mountain. Hold on, at the foot of the northern sloped mountain? Suddenly a lightning spark flashed through his brain. Don't tell me. I don't think it was pointing at the foot of the northern sloped mountain, rather it was pointing here, Anna said slowly. This is a place which contained a lot of God's stone of retaliation underground. Even after a careful search, besides a large number of indestructible God's stone of retaliation, they hadn't been able to discover anything else that was of value within the cave. Not to mention remains of ancient books, there weren't even chiseling tools used for the stone staircase left behind, which was very strange. According to the current level of technology, if they wanted to chisel out a staircase in such a steep cliff, it absolutely would be a tremendous and arduous undertaking. Things such as accidentally falling or losing tools should have been frequent occurrences. But for the current scene, besides the stones, and even more stones, it seemed as if the cave had been thoroughly cleaned before they'd left. When Roland returned to his office, he immediately called for Scroll, and had her reproduce the knight's drawing on top of her book of changes. Similar to the pattern in his memory, the southernmost point was indeed located at the foot of the northern sloped mountain. If Anna's guess is right, can it be a map left behind by the church, contains new veins of God's punishment stones? However, why would they spend all that time and effort to dig out the stairway to the bottom only to abandon it afterward? If the church had already built a church in border town 450 years ago, I am afraid that the current border town would look completely different from now. In accordance with the God's stone of retaliation selling price and its usage, it is unlikely that they would willingly give up the natural resources in this mine. Nowadays the holy city of Tequila had already become a forbidden region that was fully out of reach. Perhaps the only remaining possibility for finding the answer lies hidden within the stone tower, or perhaps it will remain unknown forever. Chapter 274 Exam. After dinner, Candle entered the castle hall quite early. On every nightfall, Teacher Scroll would give lessons in the room, but unlike the aristocracy colleges in large cities, the students who attended the lecture were witches from the Witch Union. But she wasn't the first person to come to the classroom. When she entered, Evelyn was already sitting at the long table and waving to her. Has His Highness assigned any duty to you recently? The moment Candle took her place, Evelyn couldn't stop herself from asking. She recalled the time they had only just arrived, and she had drily addressed the other party as my lord. While secretly laughing at the bottom of her heart, Candle answered, "There is. He gave me the task to cast my ability on a few strange lumps of metal, so that they would remain at room temperature, but I don't understand what use that would have." Yes. It's like that. Evelyn's eyes became dull. So far, His Highness had not asked me to do anything. He didn't provide you with adjusted practice content? Candle asked in wonder. No, I'm practicing according to my own wishes, Evelyn shook her head and said. He only occasionally comes and asks me to taste a new wine. Maybe that is just what His Highness is looking for. All your life you've been in pubs, and so you're very familiar with the taste of the drinks. There aren't many witches like you. There is no need for a witch who can taste wine at all, she protested. A salary of a gold royal is enough to recruit a specialized winemaker. Candle patted the other side's shoulder. I think His Royal Highness certainly must have a plan. Scroll also tried to comfort me this way, but even I do not know what to do with my ability. I cannot simply rely on air to turn water into wine. Don't tell me he just wants to make the tastiest type of wine to sell? But commoners are only able to afford ale of poor quality, while all the nobles have their personal preference which doesn't have anything in common with one another. Evelyn laid her chin on the table and continued in a depressed tone, and the wine His Royal Highness gives me to taste is becoming more and more hard to drink. I already suggested that he adds water or fruit juice, but he seems to only want to make the strongest wine possible. For a moment, Candle didn't know what to say. Regarding this point, she and Evelyn were both sitting in the same boat. After reaching Sleeping Island, most of the time they could only do some trifling chores. Along with the daily increase in fish oil, solidifying candles had become unnecessary, while Tilly completely forbid any sort of drinking in general. Even during the early tense phases, their supplies were often allocated according to a person's ability. Sometimes Candle would only receive some unsalted grilled fish. During this she never had the feeling that there was any problem with this approach. To the contrary, she was even willing to forego her food for those witches who needed to consume larger amounts of their magic. However, that the other witches began to divide themselves into groups and even somewhat excluded her had made her feel a little uncomfortable. Fortunately, Lady Tilly had still looked after them extremely well, even apologizing for the method of distribution, and going so far as promising that after the supplies became more plentiful, they would start to make adjustments. This way the less favored witches didn't feel the rejection that clearly anymore. But in Border Town such a situation had never occurred. All the witches sat together at the same table, and enjoyed the meal together with His Royal Highness. And the clothes they put on and the treatment shown to them didn't hold any differences, but the most important difference she'd been able to see during their daily life was that regardless whether their ability was formidable or not, they all regarded each other as a one group. Although it had only been 2 short weeks since she'd come to Border Town, she had already experienced this point very deeply. They really considered each other as sisters. Something which made Candle feel very envious. When all the witches had come and sat down, Teacher Scroll entered the room while carrying a stack of white papers. Today, I won't teach you any new content. Instead, I will conduct a comprehensive exam of what you have learned until now. What is that? Lightning asked as she raised her hand. Goo Goo? Maggie also asked. You have been studying for 3 months now, and His Highness believes that it is time to test the results of your learning. Scroll said cheerfully, all the questions have been arranged on these papers and are separated into 3 parts, Kingdom Language, Mathematics, and Nature. Altogether there are 60 questions, every answer gives a point while every mistake lowers the score. Of course, if you do not understand the problem, you just have to raise your hand and ask your question. I believe that all of you have already mastered the primary writing and reading skill, or else even if you'd known the answer, you would still be unable to answer. Scroll paused for a moment before continuing. By the way, His Highness had said that only those who have answered more than half of the question correctly will be able to enjoy ice cream during the weekend's afternoon tea. If your score is below this limit, you will lose your afternoon tea qualification. Candle suddenly heard a gasping sound. She turned around and saw Nightingale wearing a dumbstruck expression with charcoal lying in 2 pieces on the ground. Furthermore, His Highness has especially made it clear that the 5 witches that came from Sleeping Island are not to be included in this arrangement. So it is their decision whether they want to stay behind and answer or if they want to leave and have a free evening. Scroll looked one after another at Candle, Evelyn, and the others, before saying no matter what your final score is, you will be able to enjoy the delicious afternoon tea. Pooh, Evelyn patted her chest, turned her head and whispered, I won't be able to recognize all the letters, so I'm not confident that I will get the ice cream. Honey and Lotus immediately got up, happily saluted Scroll and left the hall afterward. Plus, Sylvie, whose body had been feeling somewhat unwell and thus hadn't even come to the hall, left Evelyn and Candle as the only witches from Sleeping Island in the hall. Do you want to stay? Candle asked in a small voice. I want to try, the other nodded. Didn't His Highness say that knowledge leads to evolution? If I don't work hard in this respect, I'm afraid I will never be able to compare with them. She showed a sly smile. These days I've been practicing writing my characters in my room after the class. Lily and Mystery Moon also taught me how to read and write some common words. While mentioning this, the frustration within Evelyn's voice immediately dispersed a lot, and her eyes became shiny, making it impossible for Candle not to smile. Yes, I'll also try it. Your Royal Highness, the test results have come out, Scroll said while handing the summary over to Roland. You've worked hard. Since the recent discovery beneath the Northern Slope mine, Roland was still feeling quite puzzled. So he found it difficult to concentrate on his daily tasks, so he tried to focus on something less intense. Huh? Was Nightingale's performance unexpectedly able to meet the standard required? Yes, but not only was it good enough, her grade was even in the forefront, which was partly due to her perfect language score, Scroll reported with a smile. After all, most of your topics were very simple. Furthermore, she has already learned how to read and write a long time ago, so her starting point had been much better compared to the other witches. Tisk, Roland smacked his lips, I thought I could make her eat fewer sweets with this exam. Even before his voice had completely fallen, he felt his shoulder being severely pinched. In short, the result looked quite good. All the members of the Witch Union have more than 60, so it seems that your education is bearing fruit. These results are also inseparable from their efforts. Moving his vision further down, Roland asked, only 2 of the witches of Sleeping Island participated in the test? Well, the one named Evelyn received 5 points, while Candle got 36. The latter should already have some prior foundations, so most of her points come from kingdom language. She replied. That she, even after having followed the class for only 2 weeks, was still able to receive some points outside of the writing part right, shows that her individual quality is truly astonishing. Both instincts and external knowledge are components to the continual improvement of a witch's magic. The results of their own witches were also excellent. For example, Lily, Hummingbird, Mystery Moon and the others had only spent 3 months' time from being illiterate before they grasped the basics of reading and writing, and with this they've already exceeded the majority of the people in the streets. What would the future look like when the people could put aside their prejudices and work together with the witches to promote the level of society and civilization as a whole? Roland's heart became filled with anticipation at the thought. Chapter 275 Lucia and Nightingale. Lucia was cautious and solemn as she put 3 iron chunks on the floor of her bedroom before closing her eyes. She took a deep breath, and went through the experiences from her previous practice once more, then stretched out her hand and released her ability to surround the target. This was the method of practicing that Anna had helped her come up with. Using 3 wrought iron ingots which had been especially melted by Anna that were made out of components that had nothing in common with each other, and all respectively containing silver, copper, lead, and some other impurities. Her task was to reconstruct them as pure substances while at the same time leaving behind the impurities and to also find the ingot that contained the highest amount of silver. This meant that she had to control her magic output, and always needed to work on one target first. Otherwise, it could happen that she broke the impurities further into their elements, which was what she had previously done at her home in Valencia, and was also the reason why she felt that her ability were so hard to control. Even if 2 pieces of paper looked the same, if they were restored to their original elements they could look very different. The fact that there was a relation between the amount of magic power she used and the effect of her abilities, was something she would never be able to comprehend by herself. Which led to the result that the components of some of the papers had been split apart several times, and ultimately turned most of the raw materials into water and gas. After arriving in Border Town, the first lesson the other witches taught her was that she had to practice controlling her magic. Originally Lucia wasn't convinced that those invisible and incomprehensible things could also be controlled. Only when Anna demonstrated how she was able to control the lengths of her black flame, was she finally able to discover how badly mistaken she had been. Not only could Anna adjust the output of her magic, and change the size and thickness of the black flame, she was able to reach a level of perfection in it each and every time. Elder sister, are you going to go practice again? Belle curiously stuck her head out of the bed. It's just after lunch. Lucia's hand trembled, and the iron ingot in her hand immediately turned into a pile of fine dust. I told you not to bother me when I'm using my power, she said, turning around to knock against the top of her sister's head. Concentrate on reading your letters. I'm unable to make sense of what I'm looking at, Belle said fretful. I can't even understand half of the words' meaning. I'm not like older sister, you can write and read. That's why it is important to read more. Many words have a similar structure, so even if you haven't seen them before, you should still be able to guess what it means. Literacy is a familiarizing process. Alright, Belle retracted her head. Lucia focused her attention on the second piece of iron ingot, then exercised her control to slowly release her magic. She tried to imagine a thin layer of gauze covering the ingot, and wrapping it up evenly. Hey, I came, the door suddenly squeaked, and the blonde woman dashed into the room. Hey, are you practicing your ability? Sister Nightingale. Belle shouted carefreely. The second piece of iron once again turned into a pile of fine powder. Lucia sighed and put all the metal debris on the floor into a leather bag, feeling that it might be impossible to train today. Here, this is yours. Suddenly an ice cream with a rich aroma of milk was handed over to her. Thank you, Lucia said, taking the ice cream, but shouldn't this only have been given out during the afternoon tea? Nightingale proudly patted her chest and said, Oh, that's true. But this is a special reward I requested from His Highness. Here, you also get one. With these words, she handed another one to Belle, which made the little girl immediately burst into laughter. Sister Nightingale is the best. This guy, as soon as she sees something delicious everything else gets thrown to the back of her mind, Lucia thought helplessly. But the moment the ice cream entered her mouth, and the sweet and rich taste of honey and milk spread through her mouth, together with the cold and refreshing feeling of the ice, further enhancing its sweetness, she also felt that if she had been in her sister's place she would most likely also have reacted in the same way. Even after completely swallowing it, it still left a slight chill on her teeth and her lips. No one can resist its deliciousness, especially during the hot summer. No wonder that His Highness only gives out ice cream during the weekend afternoon tea. She was afraid that this unique style of food was actually worth a lot of money. She at least had never heard of this dessert during her life in Valencia. Thinking until here, Lucia could not help but ask, how were you able to get it from His Highness? Nightingale smiled widely. I ranked third during the exam, second only to Wendy and the Leaves. However, His Highness thought I would be unable to pass the exam at all. Since the actual situation was worlds apart from his imagination, it was only natural that I requested a special reward from him. Actually, it was like this. She hesitated for a moment then asked, Then, my? 68, but I don't know your actual rank. So low. Lucia was depressed. Altogether there were 120 points, but I was only able to get a little bit more than half of them right, even though I already learned how to read and write long ago. That's pretty good, Nightingale said while patting her head. After all, how long have you been following the lectures? It's only natural that you would fall a bit short in regards to mathematics and nature. But if you ever come across any problem, you can come and ask me if you want. Me? Can I also ask? Belle raised her hand. Of course, Nightingale answered laughingly, you're welcome at any time. If I pass the elementary examination, is it possible for me to choose my own work? You are still too young, His Highness said. The minimum age to start to work is 14 years of age, but right now you are only 10 years old, so don't be so anxious. Lucia stared at her. However, the little girl was unwilling to give up so easily. I also want to help you share the pressure. In case you want to get married and have a baby, you will need to spend a lot of money. If the money is not enough, your days will become very painful. Where did you hear this? Lucia threw her hands in front of her face. Daddy said it. He was always nagging that he'd almost been unable to raise us. PFFF, ha ha ha, Nightingale couldn't suppress her laughter. If you could take a job, where would you go? Chemical laboratory. Belle raised her hand and said, I want to become an alchemist, get the title of sage and receive everyone's admiration and praise. This, better not, she shook her head. The lab is dangerous. Dangerous? The sisters asked simultaneous. Yeah, Nightingale said while spreading out her hands, not only do they often have to deal with acids, but there are also explosions sometimes. Even the chief alchemist Calcici was unable to avoid accidents. 4 of his fingers were blown away last time. I'm afraid that if it weren't for Nana's magic, Mr. Cici would have been unable to pick up any jars or bottles for the rest of his life. She paused. Furthermore, it seems that His Highness is recently trying to develop a new type of gunpowder. And even he thinks that it is extremely dangerous, so he commanded that it could only be done in a separate laboratory. In that case, do you have any good suggestions? Lucia went over and wrapped Belle into her arms, determined never to let her sister go to such a dangerous place. Without a doubt, she should enter the city hall and become a civil servant. Civil servant, she repeated. Nightingale coughed twice, cough cough, that was what His Highness called them when he was thinking out loud. Commonly speaking, they are called city hall officials. Their job is stable and safe, while their salary is on the upper level. Moreover, their prospects are also good. If you can become a department head, your rewards won't be less than that of a witch. So, it's like this, Lucia said thoughtfully. Sister Nightingale, do you like His Royal Highness? Belle asked in curiosity. In many of your sentences you say, His Highness said, my mother said, you'd only talk so much about someone if you liked them. When she heard her sister's question, Lucia's face became stiff. To hell with it. How can you directly ask such a question? This is simply too rude. At most we can be regarded as friends, so you cannot ask such a question of someone, even more so since that person is my highly esteemed senior. She felt stricken by panic and hurriedly covered Belle's mouth, but before she could even start her apologies, Nightingale already gave her a frank response. Yeah, I like him. Chapter 276 New Artillery Research and Development. While on her way to bring the ore to His Highness, Nightingale's answer was running through Lucia's mind. She had to admit, she was shocked by the calm manner in which Nightingale had revealed her feelings. Although she wasn't entirely clear about the feelings of all the people involved, but a witch and a prince simply couldn't ever be with each other, right? So shouldn't she be careful and hide her thoughts at the bottom of her heart, and never let others know about them? Furthermore, why would she as a simple listener feel so excited and embarrassed? Coming to a stop in front of the door to the office, Lucia took a deep breath before pushing open the door and entering. Your Highness, I brought the ore. Let me see, Roland answered as he fought the urge to yawn. The ruler of Border Town seemed the same as always. With his drowsy-eyed appearance it seemed it hasn't been that long since he'd finished taking his nap, and it wasn't like he was in that much of a clear-headed state yet either. While leaning comfortably against the back of his chair, showing a natural bearing and speaking with an easygoing tone, he was completely unlike the other nobles with their strict and insulting mannerism. Seeing him like this, Lucia's former indescribable nervousness loosened by a small amount. She then calmly took out the ore granules they'd found in the northern slope mine and placed them on the desk one after another. After being broken down with her ability, all those granules now seemed to have almost the same look. Their colors weren't ash-colored, but were silver-white instead, and it was probably only a brilliant person of wide learning like the prince that would be able to distinguish what these ores really were. However, even after looking at them for a long time, the prince still ended up knitting his brow. First, he took them into his hand one after another in order to estimate their weight. He then went to the window behind his desk to take a closer look from within the sunlight, only to finally wave with his hand and say, Kiki, seems I have no choice but to give these ores to Mr. Sichi to identify them. For now, you can go back to the courtyard at the north slope and continue the practice of your ability. If there is something you don't understand you can always go to Anna and ask. Huh? There exists something His Highness doesn't know? Lucia quickly bowed and said, yes. Just as she was about to leave the office, Roland called out to her again. Oh, that's right, your present test grade is pretty good, 68 ranking 9th in the class. And that's after just 1 month of learning. Showing such a performance is not easy, so you must try and keep it up. Also, he paused for a moment. I hope that Belle can also participate in the next exam together with everyone. Yes. Lucia excitedly agreed. Asterisk. After watching the little girl happily bow away, Roland looked at the metal particles on the table and sighed. I was too naive, thinking that by breaking them down into one element, I might be able to discover what kinds of ore veins are hidden within the northern slope mine. However, I once again have to acknowledge that there is a great deal of difference between mechanical engineering and geology. If that wasn't the case, I would have known that these stones would be broken down into 3 or 4 different kinds of metals. The most of the still remaining parts of the rocks can be considered as metalloid ores, but they have almost no difference in their color or shape. Such as iron, aluminum, magnesium, potassium. When in a high-purity state they are all silver-white metals. If I ever wanted to distinguish them by naked eye it will be much too difficult. In the end, it is still better to give this issue to the chief alchemist to resolve. After all, he can verify the characteristics of the material through observing their chemical reaction, which should be much more reliable than my own guesses. When he made up his mind regarding this matter, Roland took out a piece of paper and began planning on how to deal with the upcoming months of demons. Seeing that summer was about to end, these 3 months of fall were his final preparation time. Besides resisting the invasion of the demonic beasts from the west, he had also had to keep an eye on Timothy and the church who might come from the eastern side. Unlike last year where he had to pull on his lapels exposing the elbows, border towns' population and income nowadays had gone through a substantial growth. They had also gradually increased the iron production, and with the help of more than a dozen witches, he was sure that he would be able to turn the Western Territory into an impassable iron bastion. Based on to the previous year's combat experience, the greatest threat to the wall was without a doubt the mixed demonic beasts. Especially so when the enemy had a thick crust, which would be hard to wear down using bullets, and thus could only be killed by explosion at a close proximity, or by sending witches out of the city. However, no matter what kind of countermeasure he used, they both held high risks. Also, until now he had only faced attacks from the enemy's cavalry or infantry, so he had never seen this era's siege weaponry. If the other side could construct a torsion catapult, or the more advanced counterweight trebuchets, he feared that he would encounter a lot of trouble. After all, the process of loading a cannon so that it could fire was very inconvenient. Not only did they have to raise the cannon chamber each time they loaded, it was also easy for the cannonball to roll out of it. These circumstances all meant it was inevitable that he would have to develop a new cannon. After thoughtfully thinking about it, Roland began to list all of the requirements he had onto a piece of paper. First of all, it had to have a sufficient shooting distance and force, enough that it could break through the shell of a mixed species that was 1,000 meters away. Secondly, it had to be rear-loaded, this way the head could freely be lowered or raised, while still preserving its ability to shoot quickly. Finally, in order to reduce the time of repeated research and development, the cannon should also be designed to fulfill several purposes. Meaning that in addition to being used to defend a stronghold and suppress the enemy, it could also be directly pulled onto a ship and be employed as the major weapon for future heavy gunboats. Because of this, it would have to be a large caliber with a long barrel type of heavy artillery. Roland first thought of those 15 to 16 cun, 2.5 centimeters, huge monsters that were used on battleships, with a range of several scores of kilometers, and powerful enough for a shot to dig several meters deep into the ground, only to quickly reject an unrealistic idea such as this. Although there shouldn't be any problem on the processing side, but with border towns' current level of materials, it meant that at least 9 out of 10 cannons would explode. And if he thickened the cannon's wall to more than 1 meter, they would lose their practical value since he would be no longer able to move them. By now he could only give birth to high-purity wrought iron that had the performance of ordinary steel. So the plan still had to be on the conservative side. Roland finally set the caliber to the sacred number of 152 millimeters. The cannon used a vertical wedge breech block, which was upwards and downwards sliding door. When it was pulled down it exposed the cannon's chamber, and after loading it with an artillery shell, the block could be moved back up to completely lock the rear, so that the gunpowder could only erupt forward. Compared to a spiral breech block and horizontal wedge breech block, its speed was faster, and its principle was also very simple and was a blueprint he already knew by heart. However, if he wanted to implement rapid firing, the artillery had to be equipped with a recoil mechanism, which in simple terms resembled 2 bicycle pumps, one that was filled with a padding of oil and the other with a spring or gas. Due to the recoil, the muzzle would press against the 2 tubes, and would simultaneously compress the oil and the spring. The oil was used to buffer the recoil, while the spring would store the power and push the cannon back into its original position after the shell left. Lastly, the shell. Since he was already using the sacred cannon, there was no way he could be satisfied with using clumsy iron balls and paper-wrapped canister shot anymore. But Roland decided to develop 2 sets of artillery shells just to be safe. One would be the enlarged version of a bullet, with a warhead made out of solid metal, and another kind, one that had an explosive warhead and using an impact detonator, like the howitzers used by later generations. After all, he would surely come across some technological problems while developing the explosive warheads. Things like the development of a reliable detonator needed repeated testing. Because of this, he couldn't guarantee that he could achieve it before the begin of the months of demons, therefore they had to first produce the former before they could resolve the problems of the latter. Even with a solid warhead, it should still be possible to easily deal with the slow-moving thick-skinned mixed beasts and fixed siege equipment. Of course, no matter which kind of shells he used in the end, both would still consume a lot of smokeless gunpowder. In case they weren't able to start large-scale production of the two acids, the new guns could only be used as special weapons, which would mean that wanting to employ a large artillery barrage would be impossible to realize despite how much he wanted to do so. At this moment, one of his personal guards pushed open the door and entered the office. "Your Highness, a secret letter from King City has arrived." Roland put down the quill and opened the envelope. From start to finish, the letter didn't have a signature, and its handwriting was also very unfamiliar, but its short sentence made it clear that Theo was undoubtedly the one who had sent it. Today a group of about 1,000 people left King City, while heading toward the western border. Chapter 277 Theater Conflict. Longsong Stronghold, Theater Performance Hall. The curtain fell to the sound of the audience's endless whistles and cheers. May wiped the sweat from her forehead and saw Irene's gaze, full of excitement and expectation, lingering on herself. She gave 2 slight nods in response. This acknowledgement made Irene cheer out loud. The moment the curtain hit the ground, she could no longer stop herself from rushing over, and forcefully wrapped May into a hug. "Ha ha ha, I really can play it." So troublesome, May gave her a supercilious look and pushed her away. "At last you have made some progress and can now take the stage independently." "Miss May, then, what's with me?" Rosia, another actor that was playing a witch, cautiously asked her. "You still have a long way to go," she answered without hesitation. "Your expression is still stiff, your movements are sluggish, you also didn't put any feelings into your lines. During the second act you made 2 mistakes, and during the fourth act you'd positioned yourself incorrectly, which is a typical mistake if you don't memorize the script." "Haha, Miss May is indeed really strict." Guide awkwardly scratched the back of his head. However, the audience's response seems to be very good. If you listen, you can hear that the applause has yet to subside. Most of these people are civilians who have never been to the theater, so seeing a play such as this is still a new thing for them, May interjected bluntly. If this had been a regular show, those several mistakes would have been sufficient for the nobility to all let out hissing sounds. She paused. "If you want to go down the actor's road, you are never allowed to be satisfied with temporary successes. Only by continually improving yourself will you be able to gain a firm foothold on the stage." The surrounding people all simultaneously lowered their heads and said, "Yes, thank you for your guidance." May sighed. "Here we go again. I definitely cannot be considered as the drama tutor of this group of people." But in the end, she was too lazy to care about such a trivial matter and merely said, "All right, everyone carry on with your hard work. The Witch Diary will be shown at least until September, so there are still many plays during which we can develop further. This is a rare opportunity, no one should miss out on it." "Yes." 1 month ago May had received a notice from the Ministry of Education. The members of the theater team were instructed to go to Longsong Stronghold and perform. These so-called members were those inferior performers she had met at the start of her journey to Border Town, and Irene Eltek. Perhaps it was because His Highness the Prince and acting Duke Petrov had reached an agreement with the theater to let them free its schedule, so that the crew could perform the Witch Diary trilogy. And so, with this group of amateur performers, together with the newly added actors who also couldn't be considered as well-known actors, were now openly performing on the Stronghold Theater's biggest stage. At normal times, they might not even be selected as a substitute for a supporting role. Now, however, not only were they able to play the role of an important character on stage, but they could also perform hand in hand with the Star of the West, which made a lot of people lament about the impermanence of destiny. When May returned to the backstage area, she couldn't refrain from puckering her brows. There at the lounge, she saw a group of people disturbing everyone with their noise, seemingly trying to start a dispute. The moment they saw May appear, more than a dozen followed the leadership of one woman as they stepped forward and began to surround her. These people were all actors of the theater. May also recognized the woman leading them. She was called Bella Dean and was a famous actor that belonged to a different group. Some nobles even went so far as to say that she was May's biggest competitor for the position as the Star of the West, but in fact, whether it was her acting or fame, she had never been able to pressure May. Guess who I'm finally able to see? Bella bypassed May and slowly started to walk over towards Irene one step at a time, a group of inferior actors who've sneakily returned from the countryside. What did you say? Irene asked with a bewildered face. Guide, Rosia, and the others' faces all turned stiff and they couldn't stop themselves from taking 2 steps back. PFFF, Bella covered her mouth and said, she doesn't even know her own identity and status. These words aroused a burst of laughter from the group. Then let me say it directly to you, a big city such as Longsong Stronghold isn't a place where people like you should come to perform. Moreover, the Stronghold Theater also doesn't welcome such a vulgar and third-rate performance. What witch diary? It's just a few stray dogs all howling in grief. Who could ever be interested in seeing this kind of drama that's bad enough to spoil one's appetite? The earlier you get lost and return to Border Town, the better. You, Irene suddenly turned red. What do you call a third-rate performance? Didn't you hear the applause of the audience? Huh, audience? Bella sneered sarcastically. You call those people who work in the mud, and come in contact with hose and furnaces every day, an audience? Don't make me lose a tooth from laughing. Just catch some monkeys and make them run in circles and they will also be cheering loudly. If it hadn't been for the free tickets, would they ever have the spare money to come and see you perform? Irene opened her mouth but didn't know how to properly refute. The theater already has to deal with a continuous fall in revenue since you came to perform on the big stage every Wednesday. Furthermore, even we are being affected. As long as you and your drama keep on playing here, the nobility will not come. Bella raised her voice. Who would be willing to sit on greasy and dirty chairs covered with mud bits? I in turn, also do not want to come into a messy theater that your group of country bumpkins have left behind. The other side has apparently came to pick a quarrel, May thought. With the sudden appearance of Border Town's performers, many people from the theater crowd have indeed lost their chance to appear, but by no means is Bella Dean suffering under this effect. According to the news I've received from some acquaintances, after my departure from Longsong Stronghold, the theater deliberately tried turning her into the new Star of the West, so they naturally cannot cancel the drama she's starring in. Looking at Bella's action from this point of view, her purpose was clearly evident. Even though it seems she was scolding Irene and the others, in reality, her attack is directed against me. If these people shrink back, I alone cannot perform the witch diary and will have no other option than to go back to Border Town in shame. In this way, by defeating them, it is equal to defeating me. Moreover, by recovering an opportunity for the other actors to play, her prestige is also bound to rise, in that way establishing her place as the new generation Star of the West. But I will never become the stepping stone for someone else. The theater's income is falling. Are you serious? May turned and said thoughtlessly, how can you come up with such a naive judgment as to think that the theater is unable to make ends meet just because of giving away free ticket? The theater manager has undoubtedly reached an agreement with His Royal Highness and Petrov, concluding that the loss of revenue would naturally be paid for by Border Town City Hall. This is a business contract, not someone playing house. You really should use your brain rather than rely on your imagination to start shouting and screaming. You are only talking nonsense. In the end, the decrease of the income is merely because of you and this group of inferior actors with no status. May showed a faint smile. There was one time when I was performing at King City Grand Theater, which is an open-air theater. It just so happens that on the day of the show it was raining. However, the nobles still came and filled even the last seat. So, you're saying it is because of the commoners that the nobility is unwilling to watch your show? No, it's simply that they do not enjoy coming over to watch a play that is performed by a group of monkeys. The scene fell into a strange silence. Not only did no one step forward to blame them further, they weren't even trying to find an excuse. Finally, you said that the witch diary is of inferior quality and vulgar, a story about stray dogs struggling and howling in grief? The corners of May's mouth rose, her voice however, was bone-chillingly cold. I may have forgotten to tell you, but it was the prince who wrote the story for the script. Do you want to tell me that His Highness' ideas are low-grade and vulgar? Insulting the royal family is a crime punishable by cutting off the tongue. Are you still going to stick with your point of view now? She looked at the crowd standing behind Bella. Or do any of you want to give it a try? One after another, the more than a dozen actors under her gaze backed away. Enough. Bella clenched her teeth and hissed, since you've already left for Border Town, you should never have come back. May, do you think I don't know? The actual reason why you went to that broken place was not to see that idiot Irene, but Morning Light. Slap. Bella's voice stopped with a grunt. A bright red hand print was glowing on her left cheek. She touched her face, not daring to believe what had happened just now. Why you actually dare to strike? Fu. In the end, she had acted on impulse, so she took a deep breath and tried to calm herself. If it went on like this, it could cause some trouble for her later on. Sure enough, two actors behind Bella stepped forward. Miss May, you are going too far. Do you know the importance of appearance to an actress? I think that at the very least you need to apologize to her. Apologize? Isn't that the same as saying I was the one in the wrong? May couldn't help but to grimly start laughing from the bottom of her heart. The urge to act impulsively returned, but the thought to apologize never even surfaced. With a calm and collected expression, she sized up the two men with their oily hair and powdered faces, and could not help but think of what Carter Lannis had once told her. Do not look at a man's strength, they also have many weaknesses. Attacks towards their eyes or throat will make them instantly lose their resistance. Of course, there is also the place between their legs. As long as you act decisively and quickly, it is not impossible for you to knock down a man much stronger than you. Although she wasn't sure how far this could be applied to the current situation, she had already placed her feet into an attacking position, just waiting for the two men to come closer. However, at this moment, the lounge door was brutally pushed open. An armor-wearing knight came in followed by several soldiers with pikes in their hands. As they entered the room, they immediately pointed the pikes at the crowd. I heard that somebody had slandered His Royal Highness, and that a whole crew is conspiring against him. May couldn't help but stare blankly, thinking that what she had seen had to be an illusion. She forced herself to blink. However, nothing changed. The man standing in front of her showing her a secret smile was indeed the knight Carter Lannis. Chapter 278 Combat Plan. The conflict soon ended. When they saw the knights threateningly closing in on them, none of them dared to speak up. It was fair to say that the majority of actors were people who moved whichever way the wind blew, otherwise there wouldn't have been a dispute to begin with. It wasn't like everyone had the courage to stand up and confront her, the all-too-famous May. And now that the situation had completely turned around, Bella was escorted away by the two men as they immediately left the lounge. Soon after, Carter and Border Town's theater group were the only ones in the huge room. Thank you for your help, Gate, and the others said as they bowed. You were really too fierce. 2 or 3 of your sentences were already enough to turn her completely speechless. Irene said, grasping May's hands. Furthermore, that slap, she looked so perplexed, she couldn't do anything but cover it with her hand in her disbelief. She then turned towards the chief knight and saluted. Sir Carter, for what reason are you in Longsong Stronghold? About this point, I'm also very curious, May said while shrugging with her shoulders, but within her heart, she felt relief. Because of His Highness' orders, Carter answered and then asked in return, can I invite you to a drink? This is the place where you live? The chief knight appeared somewhat reserved while he surveyed the room. Yes, very ordinary, right? May took a bottle of white wine from the cupboard and poured him a small cup. The taverns only open at night, so just regard this cup as my invitation to you. Irene and the rest of the group had quickly slipped away. One by one they suddenly remembered something they had still needed to do, which left only her and Carter in the group by the time they'd reached the residence. Yes, indeed, quite ordinary. Carter coughed twice. I'm unaware about your family. My mother passed away when I was still young. I got my father a job in the theater, where he had to do all kinds of easy chores, May stated serenely, but I think he will come back in the evening. The location of the small cottage was within a dark alley of Longsong Stronghold's inner city, but she had actually spent all her savings after becoming the Star of the West to purchase it. Even though the house was small and old, but by moving away from the outer city, she at least could get away from harassment and the disturbing peeping Toms. Sorry. It's nothing, May answered, and gave herself a small cup. Did His Royal Highness let you come in order to rectify the theater's social order and solve the disputes between the actors? No, of course not, Carter repeatedly waved his hands and said, Timothy has sent some people to the Western Territory to cause some trouble again. Because of this, His Highness Roland along with the majority of the army are currently on the road. I instead took small town and arrived beforehand to arrange the Second Army, reinforce the night watch, and alert the Honeysuckle family as I do so as to prevent someone from raiding the gates and the like. These matters, you shouldn't have told me, May said shocked while shaking her head. You asked, and it's not like this is a secret operation. Carter drank the wine. Rest assured, I still have a sense of discretion. Good, she answered, curling her lips. So, how did you get to the theater? After I took care of the matters at hand, all of a sudden I happened to hear about your play and suddenly had the desire to come and see you perform on a real theater stage, wondering what it would look like. And it was just like I thought, even though I could only see the last part of the play, your performance was still wonderful, the knight praised. So, I went to backstage intending to invite you to a drink, but I didn't know whether I should come in or not. Thus, I was indecisively wandering in front of the door when I heard the argument inside. You've already been outside from early on? May frowned. I did not mean to eavesdrop, Carter said in defense while he raised his hands. It's just an accident, I promise. Puff, May couldn't suppress a chuckle and then said in comfort, I don't blame you, there is no reason to show an expression like that. You don't? The knight breathed out in relief and reached for the wine, only to get stopped by May. You still have night duty, right? May shook his finger and said, therefore, I can only let you drink a small cup and no refill. But, she smiled, wait until the end of the mission, then you can nicely invite me. After Carter left, May took another cup of wine and leaned back against the chair. Since she had tasted the wine for the first time, she discovered that she had slowly started to enjoy its hot and mellow flavor. As for Carter's previous invitation, she already had a faint answer to it within her heart. It is indeed only possible to know the results of some matters after trying them, just like the wine in my hands. Although the first taste was difficult to swallow, but compared with its following richness and mellowness, those sour and sweet fruit wines or the bland ale just can't compare. After the end of the theater season, I might as well take my father with me and settle in border town, right? Roland arrived in Longsong Stronghold 2 days later. Petrov and members of the 5 families came out of the city to welcome His Highness the Prince and his troops. After stationing the First Army into the stronghold, Roland went straight to the castle and held a brief meeting. I got my hands on reliable news that Timothy had raised a force that is advancing towards the stronghold. Roland announced after sitting down on the Lord's seat at the top of a flight of steps, while looking down on the nobles gathered beneath. Their actual number and the route they've taken is unknown, but there is no doubt that they are coming for me. According to Timothy's consistent tactic, they are bound to expand their troops by plundering and enforcing the civilians, and then use drugs to force these people to attack. Excuse me, Your Highness, the eldest son of the Wolf family interrupted puzzled, the drugs you are speaking about. A type of vicious red pill that can give civilians more strength than a knight, but after the effect wears off, those who took it can only helplessly struggle before dying. In addition to Petrov, the other 4 influential families didn't know about the church's secret medicine, so Roland gave a simple description of the characteristics and the source of the pill. Then he continued, through this plan Timothy continues to weaken the resistance of the Western Territory. Any person he cannot use is a target of looting and enforcing, the same goes for your territory. As the protector of the Western Territory, I request that you clearly explain this situation to your family's staff and the commoners staying on your land, and that you transfer all of them into the city, so that Timothy won't be able to expand his force. But the food and stored goods in our warehouses. You can move as much as possible, Roland decisively interrupted, however, I can only give you 3 days, until then all the commoners in the surrounding have to have been gathered together inside of the stronghold. After I beat back Timothy's troops, you can all naturally leave. After the conclusion of the meeting, the prince summoned Iron Axe to the castle. In fact, by no means had he disclosed the exact situation to the nobility. Lightning and Maggie were already able to expose the whereabouts of the troops coming from King's City. Unlike the previous group of invaders, they were traveling by sailboat this time, and moving straight along the Redwater River's channel in an attempt to enter the hinterland of the Western Territory by passing through Willow Town. This was a very thorny route. At the time the enemy came to the river's bifurcation point, they could either follow the tributary to attack Longsong Stronghold's southern and eastern gate or continue following the river westwards and go straight for Border Town. In order to prevent his defending troops from needing to split up and create a situation of attending to one thing and losing sight of another, he needed to concentrate his superior military strength and take the initiative to go out and defeat the enemy. Evidently, the Redwater River's bifurcation would be the most suitable place for such an ambush. Chapter 279 Battle Lineup. After entering the hall, Iron Axe gave a standard military salute. Timothy's troops are expected to reach the junction in the Redwater River 4 days from now. The First Army will set off this afternoon, Roland bluntly spoke. You will meet up at the battle site with Border Town's defensive troops and take over the command. I will travel there as quickly as possible. Don't we need to defend Border Town? All of the enemy's movements are under the surveillance by Lightning and Maggie. Setting up a defensive division is no longer necessary. Just one joint attack to the right side should be enough to smash the enemy. The prince paused, but we also need to lead 100 soldiers in Longsong Stronghold to watch over those nobles. Remain here? Iron Axe asked, shocked. Roland summarized his previous released orders to the 5 families. The reason that I gathered them together was to make it more convenient to watch over them. This will keep them from having any thoughts after learning about Timothy's attack on the Western Territory. The Second Army's weapons are old and their combat experience is lacking, so in case they encounter an unexpected situation they may not respond to it. However, with the 10 squadrons of First Army soldiers, we can ensure that the nobles cannot lift any wind and waves. Since I do not want to fight at the Redwater River Junction, only to birth riots at my back. As you bid, Your Highness, he said. Do you have to go? After Iron Axe had left the hall, Nightingale stepped out from behind the Lord's seat and asked him. Of course, Roland said, if I do not go, who else could make good use out of Lotus' ability? I may not be adept at commanding battle strategy, but I'm damn good at using bunkers to seal off roads and tanks to slap faces. Bunker I know of, however, what is this tank? Nightingale's face showed her confusion. Oh, they are carriages which drag around a cannon, the prince coughed twice. But currently we do not have enough horses, so we have to rely on Little Town to transport the cannons, which like this cannot be called tanks. That's the reason why you picked Honey? She blinked and asked, as far as I know, she can even tame tigers and panthers, making them as gentle as horses. But aren't tanks nothing more than cannons which are pulled by wild animals? Of course, Roland couldn't refrain from tilting his mouth. The different models can also straightforwardly be named Tiger and Panther. Just then, Carter, holding a white-tailed kite in his arms, came in and announced, Your Highness, there is news from Border Town. Roland clapped his hands. Immediately after, as if it had intelligence, the white-tailed kite unfolded its wings, freed itself from the knight's arms and soared into the air, gliding the short distance to firmly land on his shoulder. Feeling the kite land on his shoulder, he took a piece of jerky from his pocket and gave it to the bird to swallow. It also conscientiously raised its claw, so that Roland could easily untie the cloth tied to it. The kite wasn't Maggie in her hawk form, it was one of Honey's trained air messengers. They could remember 5 to 6 different people, as well as hundreds of flight routes. Even in case that they were brought to an unknown place, they could still find their way home. This time, for his trip to the stronghold, Roland had brought a total of 4 messengers. Within 1 hour they could travel from one place to the other and back. Furthermore, they could also fly for a whole day without having to take a break. In the absence of a wireless transmission, this way of keeping in touch counted as the quickest method. Roland spread out the letter wrapped into the cloth and quickly skimmed over its content. The author of the letter was Wendy. She was reporting that according to his request she had already carried Lotus, Sylvie, Leaves, Hummingbird, and Nana to the fork of the Redwater River. Some artillery members had also traveled together with them. They'd also taken 8 cannons with them, which was the maximum number of cannons that Little Town could accommodate. The prince had estimated that in case Wendy traveled at full speed with Little Town, the cement ship would take about a day to reach the destination. Even though they had Sylvie as their navigator, which made it possible for the ship to travel at night, Wendy's magical source was much smaller compared to Anna's, which meant it was impossible for her to use her ability continuously like Anna could. They would therefore need to rest during the night and travel during the day. So with one trip to and fro taking 2 days, the 4 days would be merely enough time for them to have transported 16 field cannons to the river fork. Even though their number was less than during the last battle, but taking into account the surprise raid and the fact that the other side was traveling on ships, it would be impossible for the enemy to counterattack. This amount of firepower would be just barely enough to defeat them. Roland took the pen Nightingale offered and wrote a new set of instructions. He ordered the defense troops to immediately arm themselves and set off. Furthermore, after having reached the river fork they were instructed to merge into one large force under Iron Axe's command. Only half an hour later, the white-tailed kite would have delivered the letter into Scroll's hands, who would then hand it over to Captain Brian. The next morning, Roland himself arrived at the scheduled location. Reaching the place where the clear and gleaming river divided itself in two, one stream flowing towards Longsong Stronghold, the other carrying on until Redwater City. As the latter river branch was wider, the people used to regard it as the main channel of the Redwater River, while calling the stream leading to the stronghold Little Redwater. After disembarking, they were immediately welcomed by the witches, who had been waiting at the riverside for a long time. Looking around, Roland asked, "Wendy?" "She is already on her way back, together with Little Town," Leaves reported. "She said that there is another batch of cannons which has to be shipped." "I heard that you are going to deal with Timothy Wimbledon, the fake king who hunts for witches within the cities every day." Lotus could no longer wait and asked, "What is it you want us to do?" Although Iron Axe and the main force of the First Army had yet to arrive, as long as the witches were here, the preparatory work could still be carried out in advance. "I need to build a line of defense on both sides of the main river," Roland explained while squatting down and using a stone to draw on the ground. "This line represents the enemy's route forward, so I will split my troops and place them on both sides of the river to launch a sudden pincer attack. However, in order to successfully surprise them, they will have to remain hidden until the attack has begun. So, it is important that you raise a soil house forming a large V shape on both sides of the river. The houses should have a long form, the walls must be thick, the inside should be divided into 8 individual compartments and there should only be small windows on the side of the Redwater River." "Your Highness, I don't get it." Lotus was clearly puzzled. "If you put the soldiers hidden in the soil house you will be able to conceal their whereabouts, but this way they won't be able to attack the ships on the river. In case the fake king's fleet absolutely doesn't stop nor pulls toward the shore, and instead directly pass by, what should be done then?" "No, they are unable to make it through," Roland laughed. "You'll know why when the time comes." Then he turned to Leaves. "You are responsible for covering these fortifications with weeds and vines so that everything appears more natural." "Yes," Leaves answered. As a result, when the artillery was pushed into the hidden fortifications, the 2 soil houses Lotus had thought to be useless were instantly transformed into an unsinkable battleship. When the time came around, as long as they lifted the cover plate in front of the windows, each compartment could then let out a deadly flame. It was unlikely that the 16 field cannons would lose aim because of jolts. In fact, shooting at such a close range, it should be possible to hit the ships sailing in the middle of the river even if their eyes were closed. Granted that the attacks were unable to sink the ships, it should still be sufficient to turn their decks into Azura's realm. Furthermore, from the very beginning, the enemy will be at the disadvantageous point of the T, Roland proudly thought. "You tell me, being at the T's superior position, how could I ever lose?" Chapter 280 Redwater River Ambush, Part 1. The enemy's fleet took longer to reach the fork in the Redwater River than expected, Instead of late morning, it was already afternoon of the fourth day when the 10 sailing ships slowly appeared at the end of their field of view. Receiving this news, Vanner forwarded it to the sixth compartment, turned to the artillery team he was responsible for and gave the order for them to prepare to shoot, then returned to his shooting position. "Where is the enemy?" Rodney asked while opening the window's cover plate to look around. "They are at least still several hundred meters away from us," Cat's Claw, in charge of observing the signal flags, murmured while he looked through the sky window. "I can't even see their shadows, there are too many weeds on the roof." Each compartment, in addition to the shooting window, also came with a second window at the top of the wall. After climbing the 2-step staircase made of earth, it was possible to see the situation on the Redwater River through the window. "Speaking of the weeds, the ability of the green hair, which is simply inconceivable," Jop said while wiping away some of the cannon's rust marks. "Wherever she goes, grass grows to be as long and as thin as her hair." After completely covering the bunkers, they now look completely like ordinary soil hills. There is no difference between the two. "What green hair witch?" Vanner said beratingly. "That's Miss Leaves. At the time, when we confronted the Duke's Knight for the first time, she helped us by planting the vines on both sides of the forest, making it impossible for the knights to bypass us. Otherwise, they could have gone around us through the wood and attacked us from behind." "With their magic, what kind of witch is ordinary?" Rodney asked while he shrugged his shoulders. "One can build those bunkers within one night, the other covers the ground with vines and weeds, one can fly freely in the sky, and one can even change into a giant dove. These are things no mortal could ever do. If I have to choose, the most amazing one is Miss Nana." Cat's Claw's voice was full of longing and expectation. "I do not know if it is an honor to be wounded nowadays." "As long as you're wounded, then you can see her from close range, maybe even hear some comforting words from her. For my benefit, pay careful attention to the enemy's position." Vanner snapped. "If any of you dare to talk any more rubbish, I will punish you with cleaning the toilet when we return." Hearing the threat, Cat's Claw stuck out his tongue, and then turned his body around to explore the outside situation. The artillery captain sighed in his heart. Nowadays these guys have lost their sense of tension. They weren't like a few months ago where their hands and feet trembled at the beginning of the battle. He couldn't say if this changes were good or bad. He always felt that some of them held too much contempt towards the opponent, but he also couldn't severely reprimand his men, because he was in no way better than them. Since he had become a soldier of His Royal Highness, Vanner's understanding of battle had undergone changes as great as the difference between sky and earth. The seemingly bloody and cruel fights no longer had anything to do with your personal strength, skill, and courage. They now only needed repetitive drills to learn all of the necessary steps by heart. Ready themselves according to the rules, meet the enemy according to those rules, and open fire according to the rules was equivalent to winning. Especially when Border Town had to withstand the attack of the new king's militia, the opponent obviously had astonishing strength, a fierce spirit, and didn't show any fear of death, just like humanoid beasts. But the fight only lasted for half an hour. When it was time to clear the battlefield, he discovered that he didn't feel even the slightest trace of fatigue, as if he had only gone through a warm-up exercise before his training, yet they had already exterminated the enemy. In this way, will there be a day when they will fight wars over distances where they couldn't even see the enemy's face? Will they be able to wipe out the enemy thousands of miles away just by operating some metallic machines? Just when Vanner got lost in his own world, he was drawn back by Cat's Claw's warning shout. "I see the enemy. Fill in the ammunition." Vanner ordered with a firm voice while shaking his head, pushing all of the distracting thoughts to the back of his head. The people within the compartment suddenly became busy. They had already gone through the following steps so many times that they could now fill the cachet and artillery shell into the chamber even if their eyes were closed. Under the circumstances that they didn't need to reset the cannon into the starting position or to adjust the shooting angle, the artillery group could easily shoot once every 20 breaths. His Highness Roland and Iron Axe had already planned and put the strategy for the battle long ago. Moreover, it was similar to Border Town's previous defense battle, so Vanner could fluently recite it from memory. Therefore, the moment they saw Miss Lightning wave the red flag, they immediately tore down the window's cover plate and opened fire. The two cannons nearest to the riverbank were filled with bullet canisters intended to wipe out the deck, while the rest of the cannons bombarded the hold of the ships with their solid shells. He calmly waited for the arrival of the red signal. Lotus no longer needed an observation mirror to keep a lookout. She could see that the fleet of the fake king had already neared the ambush place. Compared to the three-masted or four-masted seafaring sailing ships, these ships were notably much slimmer, had no tall rigging or fences, and with their low hull, they looked as if they were at the same level of the river. In addition to their bulging sails, they were also pushed forward by sailors on both sides of their decks, who were slowly pulling the helms in their hands. Even now, His Royal Highness still hadn't issued any new orders. She could not help but become somewhat anxious, standing at their observation point located at the top of a high hill. Even though they could overlook the whole battlefield from here, it was still far away from the river. Without Lightning or Maggie by His Highness' side, sending new instructions to each team would waste a lot of time, and even if they were only a little late, Lotus was afraid that there wouldn't be enough time to stop the fleet from passing through the Redwater River fork. Seeing that the leading sailboat was about to pass by the soil houses, Lotus couldn't help but want to open her mouth to inquire, but at that very moment, a loud bang suddenly rolled over the river. As if this were the signal to attack, more than a dozen thick smoke clouds mixed with a blazing flame came spouting out of the soil house, sending an unending oppressive and earth-trembling sound across. In the end, what exactly had happened? When Lotus turned her eyes back to the river, she could hardly believe what she was seeing. She didn't see any fight between knights or mercenaries. However, on the deck of the first sailboat, it looked like a boiling pot had just exploded. Wood chips, disabled limbs, and severed arms splashed everywhere in all directions. More than half of the scullers had been killed or injured in a flash, and as the bloody mist cleared up, it had smeared the deck a bloody red. After losing half of its moving force, the speed of the vessel quickly slowed down, while the thundering explosion sound hadn't stopped for even the slightest moment. Not long after, several shadows cut the tall mast at the center of the ship in half. It shook twice before falling to the ground with a loud bang, burying two knights who had just climbed out of the cabin under it. The sailboat was pushed by the water current and slowly began receding, while the other ships fanned out while trying to avoid it. After hearing the cacophony of sounds, lots of people rushed out from within the hold of the ship, only to helplessly look at the leading ship which had already sunken into hell, seemingly not knowing what they should do anymore. Then the horrible attack fell on the second ship. The bloody mist emerging from the now crowded deck became even more raging, and Lotus could see that after another round of rolling thunder, those enemies who originally stood nearest to the river bank had been completely broken apart and had given birth to many scarlet-red empty spots. Those people who were still alive gave out heartbreaking screams as they tried to push their intestines back into their body. While other lucky survivors immediately jumped into the river to try and escape, no longer willing to spend another breath in the hell on top of the deck. Finally, Lotus understood what His Highness had meant when he said that they would not be able to get through, but how had his men been able to do this?